My father called me exactly 1 week after my wedding and asked for $40,000 before the end of the day. Not $10,000, not whatever I could spare. $40,000, as if he were asking me to pick up milk on my way home. I was standing in my kitchen with my coffee going cold beside me when he said, "Morgan, I need your help. I need $40,000 today." I stared at the steam thinning above my cup and thought about the 2 empty chairs at my wedding reception. I thought about my mother telling me my wedding was a waste of time for someone like you. Then boarding a plane to Hawaii with my younger sister's family. So I let Dad finish. I let him explain how urgent it was, how family was supposed to help family, how I was the one person he could count on. Then I said, "Sorry, Dad. I don't have time for things that aren't worth it." And I hung up. At the time, I thought that was the end of the story. A few hours later, I learned it was only the first time that day I would hear the number 40,000. Before I tell you what I found next, I hope you're doing well wherever you're listening from today. Stay with me, because that phone call turned out to have almost nothing to do with the reason my father gave me, and everything to do with a decision my parents had made without my permission. And if stories about family secrets, betrayal, and consequences are your kind of thing, subscribe to the channel and stay with me until the end. 3 months have passed since all of this happened, and there is one voicemail from my father I still haven't deleted. I almost did several times. I kept telling myself there was no reason to hold on to it anymore, because by then I knew what had happened, and everyone who mattered knew too. But every time my thumb hovered over delete, I stopped. Maybe because it reminds me how ordinary his voice sounded that morning. There was no panic in it at first. No shame. He sounded inconvenienced, like a man whose flight had been delayed or whose mechanic had discovered an expensive repair. That was probably why I didn't understand immediately that he wasn't asking me to solve a problem. He was asking me to erase one. When Dad called that Friday morning, Ethan had already left for work. I had taken the morning off because our wedding gifts were still stacked along one wall of the dining room, and I had promised myself I would finally deal with them. My husband, Ethan, is the kind of person who can leave 3 unopened boxes beside a chair for a week without noticing them. I am not. I like lists. I like knowing what has been paid, what still needs attention, and what happens next. It is one of the reasons I became good at operations management. Give me a deadline, 3 vendors who disagree with each other, and a delivery that has gone missing somewhere between Indianapolis and Columbus, and I become calmer, not more nervous. My father knew that about me. Looking back, I think he had known it for far too long. "Morgan," he said when I answered, "I need $40,000 today." There was no hello beyond my name. I set down the thank you card I had been writing. "For what?" "It's temporary." That wasn't my question. He exhaled through his nose. I could picture the expression because I had seen it all my life. Dad did not enjoy being asked to explain decisions he considered already made. I have a financial issue I need to bridge for a little while. What kind of financial issue? It's complicated. Who gets paid? Silence. I walked into the kitchen and leaned against the counter. "Dad, if you need $40,000 from me today, somebody must be expecting $40,000. Who?" "Morgan, why does that matter?" "Because it's my money." His tone changed slightly, not angry yet, offended. "I said I'd pay you back." "When?" "As soon as I move a few things around." "What things?" "For God's sake, send me the invoice." "There isn't an invoice." "Then send me whatever explains why you need $40,000. That was when I heard my mother in the background. I couldn't make out everything she said, only my name and then louder. "After everything we've done for her?" A week earlier, I might have swallowed that sentence and pretended it did not hurt. That morning, it made something inside me go very still. Dad lowered his voice. "This is family, Morgan. So explain it to me like family. I don't have time for this interrogation. I need to know whether you can help me." He did not ask whether I had $40,000 available. He did not ask whether moving that much would cause a problem for me and Ethan. He did not ask whether I needed to speak with my husband first. In my father's mind, those questions had already been answered. I had a good job. Ethan had a good job. We lived below our means. I kept emergency savings. Dad knew that because years earlier, when he had needed help with what he called a roof emergency, I had been able to lend him money. Another time, when he said a tax issue had caught him by surprise, I had helped again. I had never told him exactly what I kept in savings, but that had not stopped him from deciding my money was available. I looked at the calendar hanging beside our refrigerator. Our wedding date was still circled in blue ink, even though it had passed 7 days earlier. Dad, what happens if I say no? Another pause. Then he said, your grandmother could lose something important. That got my attention. Grandma? I'm handling it. What does Grandma have to do with this? I said I'm handling it. I straightened away from the counter. Then handle it. Morgan. No. You called me asking for $40,000 with no explanation. You won't tell me who it's for. You won't send me documentation. Now you're using Grandma to make me feel guilty. I'm not transferring anything. Mom said something again behind him. This time I heard every word. She's still punishing us over that ridiculous wedding. My wedding had cost less than the vacation they had chosen instead. I closed my eyes for a second. Put Mom on speaker. You're already on speaker. Of course I was. Good, I said. Then she can hear me too. Dad warned me not to start. I didn't. I let him finish. I listened while he told me I was being emotional, even though I was the only person on that call asking for facts. He reminded me that he had always been there when I needed him. I could have argued with that. I could have listed the birthdays they had left early, because Chelsea was upset. The college move I had handled without them because my sister had a breakup that weekend. The Christmas Mom had spent in Chelsea's guest room because Chelsea and Ryan were fighting while I drove Grandma home alone through freezing rain. I didn't. None of that would have answered the only question that mattered. Where was the $40,000 going? Dad never answered. When he finally stopped talking, I heard my mother sigh dramatically in the background. So I gave them back the sentence she had given me 7 days earlier. Sorry, Dad. I don't have time for things that aren't worth it. Then I ended the call. For about 30 seconds. It felt satisfying. After that, it mostly hurt. The wedding had been on the first Friday in May. Ethan and I had chosen a small venue outside Columbus, a restored brick building with tall windows and a courtyard that turned green as soon as spring settled in. We had around 60 guests. Nothing about it was extravagant, but nothing about it was cheap or careless either. We had saved for it. We paid our vendors on time. We invited people we genuinely wanted there. I was 38 years old, marrying a man I loved, and I had reached an age where I thought I had finally stopped needing my parents to approve of my choices. Then my mother proved there was still a difference between not needing approval and not feeling rejection. 3 weeks before the wedding, Mom called and told me she and Dad would not be attending. Chelsea and Ryan were having a difficult time. Mom said they needed family support. She and Dad had decided to take them and their 2 children to Hawaii for what she called a reset. I reminded her of the date. I know the date, she said. So you booked Hawaii anyway? Morgan, Chelsea's marriage is under enormous stress. And I'm getting married. That's different. I waited. Mom sighed as if I were forcing her to explain arithmetic to a child. You're fine. You and Ethan are fine. You're almost 40. You don't need us hovering around you for every milestone. I'm not asking you to hover. I invited you to my wedding. She went quiet for a moment, and then she said the sentence I would repeat to my father a week later. I'm not wasting an entire weekend on a wedding like that. Not for someone like you. There are insults that arrive hot and loud. That one did not. It landed quietly because of how ordinary she made it sound. I asked what someone like me meant. Mom told me not to be dramatic. Dad never called to contradict her. He never said she had gone too far. He sent a short text 2 days later, saying he hoped I understood that Chelsea needed them. I replied with one word, okay. I did not beg. I did not threaten to cancel. I did not ask relatives to pressure them. I changed the seating chart. At the reception, their 2 places remained empty, because I had not been able to bring myself to remove their names until that morning. Grandma Ruth sat nearby in a navy dress she had bought for the occasion. She squeezed my hand once before dinner and never said anything about her son's absence. She did not need to. Ethan noticed me glance at the empty seats only once. He reached for my hand under the table, and we went back to listening to his sister tell a story about the first time she met me. That was the life I had chosen. For most of the evening, it was enough. The morning Dad asked for $40,000, Ethan came home for lunch because he had forgotten a set of drawings he needed for an afternoon site meeting. He found me still standing in the kitchen, though by then I had moved from coffee to water. "You look like you want to reorganize the garage with your bare hands," he said. Dad called. He waited. "He needs $40,000. Ethan put his keys down. "For what?" "Apparently that is classified information." I told him the rest. He did not immediately say, "Don't give them anything." That was one of the reasons I loved him. Ethan rarely gave me answers before asking whether I wanted one. "You okay?" he asked. "I'm fine." His eyes stayed on mine. "I am. You just repeated the sentence your mother used about our wedding." I noticed. "Did it feel good?" "For about 30 seconds. He nodded, as if that made sense. Then he reached for his drawings. "I had everyone I needed at the wedding," I told him. He stopped, but he didn't challenge me. He kissed my forehead and said he would be home around 6. Looking back, that was the first lie I told in this story, and I told it to myself. I had had enough people at my wedding to be happy, that was true, but I had wanted my parents there. That was also true. Pretending I had never needed them did not make me stronger. It only made it easier for everyone to believe I never needed anything. My grandmother called at 11:43. I remember the exact time because I wrote it at the top of the first page of notes I eventually kept about all of this. "Are you busy?" she asked. "Not really. I have a question about a bank statement." Grandma Ruth was 82 and still lived in the same house where my father had grown up. She had undergone hip surgery the previous fall and had recovered well, but she hated driving in heavy traffic now and had started thinking seriously about moving somewhere smaller. Dad had been helping her with bills and banking since the surgery. "What kind of question?" "There's a number here I don't recognize." "What number?" She hesitated. "I'd rather show you." That was unusual. Grandma was not secretive about ordinary things. "Is Dad there?" "No." Something in her voice made me sit straighter. "I can come over. Harbor Pines left a message this morning. They said they'll call back after lunch. I want to understand this before I talk to them." I knew Harbor Pines was the independent living community she had been considering. She had toured it twice and complained that their dining room coffee tasted like warm dishwater, which somehow had not stopped her from wanting an apartment there. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. Her house was less than 15 minutes from mine without traffic. I found her at the dining room table with a folder, reading glasses, a yellow legal pad, and the blue cloth-bound ledger she had used for as long as I could remember. Grandma wrote down everything important: gifts, loans, large home repairs, donations. She distrusted the idea that because a computer remembered something, she no longer had to. When I was a teenager, Dad used to tease her about it. "The bank already keeps records, Mom." Grandma would tap the book with her pen, and now so do I. I barely noticed the ledger that day. It had always been there. She slid the bank statement across the table. "Here." I looked where she had marked a line in pencil. A transfer. $40,000. For a moment, I thought I had misread it because the number was too exact. Too familiar. I checked the date. Then I checked it again. The transfer had happened before the wedding. "Grandma, do you remember moving $40,000 out of this account?" "No." "Did you ask Dad to?" "Not that I remember." I did not say he stole it. I did not say Hawaii. I did not tell her he had called me that morning. Not yet. I looked at the transfer reference. The receiving account name was abbreviated, but the surname Harris was visible. So were the last 4 digits. Something tightened low in my stomach. I had seen those digits before. Years earlier, when Dad had asked me for money for that roof emergency, he had texted me his banking information. Same last 4 digits. Grandma watched my face. "What is it?" I turned the statement back toward her and kept my voice even. "Dad called me this morning." Her eyebrows lifted. "He asked me for $40,000. Grandma did not move. For a few seconds, the only sound in the room was the old refrigerator humming in the kitchen. Then her phone rang. She looked at the screen. Harbor Pines. I looked at the statement again, at the $40,000 that was no longer where Grandma thought it was, and then at the clock on the wall. My father had not called because he suddenly needed money sometime that week. He needed it that morning. Before Grandma started asking questions, Grandma let the phone ring twice before she answered. I stayed on the other side of the dining room table with the bank statement in front of me and made myself look away from the $40,000 transfer. I didn't want my expression turning a routine call from Harbor Pines into an accusation before either of us knew what had happened. Grandma put the call on speaker only after the woman introduced herself and asked whether she still wanted to remain on the waiting list. Yes, Grandma said. I do. The woman explained that a one-bedroom unit Grandma had toured months earlier had unexpectedly become available. Another applicant had backed out, and because Grandma was next on the list, Harbor Pines wanted to know whether she was still interested before they moved to the next person. There was no dramatic demand to wire $40,000 by noon. Nothing that sounded like the manufactured emergency Dad had presented to me. Grandma had a short window to confirm that she wanted the apartment and then complete the financial verification and entrance deposit process according to the paperwork she had already received. The woman mentioned that she had tried calling earlier that morning, then contacted the alternate financial contact listed on Grandma's application when she couldn't reach her. Grandma looked at me. I looked back. Who did you call? She asked. Robert Harris, the woman said. He confirmed that you were still considering the move. But of course we needed to speak with you directly before moving forward. That explained more than I wanted it to. Dad had known about the available unit before he called me. He had known Grandma was about to speak with Harbor Pines. He had known the financial verification process would bring her attention back to the account where she believed $40,000 was sitting untouched. He hadn't needed my money because somebody was going to seize an asset at 5 o'clock or because an investment was collapsing. He had needed it before Grandma looked closely enough to discover that the money was gone. Grandma thanked the woman, confirmed she wanted the unit held while she reviewed the paperwork, and wrote down the next steps in her neat block handwriting. She asked 2 questions about the timeline, one about whether the entrance deposit remained tied to that specific unit, and another about what financial documents they needed from her. I watched her handle the call exactly as she had handled nearly everything in her life. Calmly, carefully, with no interest in being rushed, simply because someone else had created urgency. When the call ended, she put the phone down beside the blue ledger. He knew, I said. Grandma folded her hands. He knew they called me. He knew they had a unit. They called him this morning when they couldn't reach you. She looked toward the statement. So that's why he called you. I think it's why he called me today. I deliberately said think. There was a difference between what made sense and what I could prove, and I didn't want anger closing that distance for me. Dad had asked me for the same amount that had left Grandma's account. He had known Harbor Pines was about to contact her. Those were facts. What he had done with the money, and whether Grandma had ever given him some kind of permission she had forgotten, were still questions. Grandma reached for the statement again. This account was for Harbor Pines. I nodded. You told me you were saving for it. No. She tapped the paper. I mean this account specifically. I moved money into it so I wouldn't touch it for anything else. That mattered. I had known Grandma was considering moving, but I hadn't known how deliberately she had separated the money. She had lived in that house for more than 3 decades, long enough for every room to contain a version of our family. The hallway still had tiny pencil marks from when Dad and his younger brother were children. The guest room held a cedar chest filled with photographs Grandma refused to digitize because, according to her, nobody ever gathered around a cloud account after dinner. Her kitchen cabinets had been built for a woman 5 inches taller than she was, and for years she had used a little wooden step stool without complaint. Then she had fallen the previous autumn. It hadn't been catastrophic, but the hip surgery and recovery changed the way she looked at the house. The stairs became something she measured before climbing. Grocery trips required planning. Carrying laundry to the basement became a negotiation with herself. She had recovered well enough to live independently, but she no longer wanted to wait until independence was taken from her by an emergency. I'm not moving because someone decided I can't take care of myself, she told me. I'm moving because I would like to decide while I still can. That sentence stayed with me. She had toured Harbor Pines twice. It wasn't a nursing home, and she wasn't moving there because anyone had declared her incapable. It was an independent living community with smaller apartments, transportation, meals available if she wanted them, maintenance she would no longer have to manage, and enough activities to make her complain that they were trying too hard to keep old people busy. She had laughed about the terrible dining room coffee, praised the library, criticized the carpeting, then gone home and started doing the math. The $40,000 was part of that math. It was supposed to stay there, she said. I didn't need it earning anything clever. I needed it available. I looked toward the blue ledger. Did you write that down? Grandma followed my eyes and almost smiled. You used to make fun of that book too. I was 16. You were 18. That makes it worse. She opened it anyway. I expected her to search immediately for the transfer, but she didn't. Instead, she showed me a page from earlier that year. There was a furnace repair, a charitable donation, a gift she had given one of my cousins for a home purchase, and a small loan to Dad from the previous winter that had already been marked repaid. Date, amount, name, purpose. Nothing elaborate. Nothing legal-looking. Just the private accounting system of a woman who had spent most of her adult life making sure she knew where her money went. Dad had teased her about that ledger for as long as I could remember. The memory came back so clearly that for a moment I could see his old kitchen chair instead of the one in front of me. I must have been 12 or 13. Chelsea was crying in the living room because she had forgotten she needed supplies for a school project due the next morning, and Dad was already putting on his coat to drive across town to the only store still open. Mom was searching the kitchen drawers for cash. Grandma sat at the table writing something in the blue book while everyone moved around her. Dad laughed when he saw her. Mom, the bank already keeps records. Grandma never looked up. And now so do I. At the time, I had thought Dad was right. The book seemed unnecessary, one of those habits older people held onto because they didn't trust computers. Sitting beside it 25 years later, I wasn't so sure. Grandma turned another page. Here, she said. The entry was several months old. Harbor Pines Reserve. $40,000. Do not move. I read it twice. That's pretty clear. It was clear to me. I didn't say what both of us were thinking. Dad's version would matter now. Because if he claimed Grandma had later changed her mind and told him verbally that he could use the money, a handwritten note by itself wouldn't settle everything. But it showed what Grandma had intended when she set the money aside. And more importantly, it reminded me that she was not confused about why the account existed. I asked, when did Dad start helping with your banking? After surgery. Because you couldn't manage it? Her eyebrows went up. I realized how the question sounded. That came out wrong. Yes, it did. I smiled despite myself. Because getting around was harder. That's better. She explained that Dad had been doing practical things for her since the operation. Paying a contractor when she couldn't get out. Moving money between accounts when she asked. Handling a few insurance and property bills. She had signed financial power of attorney documents so he could act for her when necessary, without turning every ordinary payment into a logistical problem. Did you give him permission to decide what your money should be used for? No. Did you tell him he could move this reserve wherever he thought it would perform better? No. Did you ever tell him he could loan it to himself? Grandma stared at me. I held up a hand. I'm not saying he did. I'm asking what you authorized. She looked back toward the statement. I authorized him to help me. That was the cleanest description of the problem I had heard yet. Help had quietly become authority. Or, Dad believed it had. I knew enough about him to understand how easily that could happen. When we were children, Chelsea was the one whose problems filled rooms. She wasn't malicious. She simply seemed to move through life with alarms going off around her. At 15, she forgot a permission form for a school trip, and Mom drove 40 minutes to deliver it. At 17, she missed an application deadline, and Dad called 3 people trying to get an exception. When she got her first flat tire, Dad left dinner halfway through to rescue her even though she had roadside assistance. My problems were usually quieter because I had learned early to solve them before anyone noticed. When I was 23, My car died during my first real job. I had enough savings to replace it with a used Honda, so I took a bus to work for 4 days while I found one. Mom learned about the whole thing after I had already bought the car. "That's my Morgan," she said. "You always figure it out. That's why we never have to worry about you." I had been proud of that sentence. For years, I carried it like a compliment. Only later did I understand the bargain hidden inside it. Chelsea could need things because needing things was part of who she was. I was rewarded for needing nothing, which meant every time I successfully handled my own life, I gave my parents another reason not to show up for it. Still, none of that proved Dad had misused Grandma's money. So, I didn't call him a thief. I didn't call Chelsea. I didn't call the bank pretending to be Grandma. I sat at that dining room table and asked Ruth what she wanted to know. She looked at me for a long moment. "I want to know where my $40,000 is. Then the first person we ask is Dad." She nodded. "Do you want me to call him?" "Yes, but I want to hear." So I put my phone on the table between us and called. Dad answered on the second ring. "Morgan, I'm with Grandma." Silence. It was brief, but it was there. Grandma heard it too. Dad recovered quickly. "Good. Then maybe you can help her understand what's happening." I looked at Grandma. She gave me a small nod. "Dad, why did $40,000 leave Grandma's Harbor Pines reserve?" He didn't ask what I meant. He didn't say, "What 40,000?" That was the first answer he gave me. "I moved it temporarily," he said. "To where?" "An account where it could be managed better." "Managed how?" "Morgan, I don't need you auditing me. Grandma does. That money was sitting there doing nothing." Grandma leaned toward the phone. "Robert?" His voice changed instantly. Softer. Patient. The voice adults use when they have already decided the older person on the other end is confused. "Mom, I was handling it. You asked me to handle things. I asked you to help with my banking." "Exactly." "No, not exactly." Dad exhaled. "The money wasn't gone, I moved it." "Why?" "It was temporary." "To do what?" "I'm sorting out a financial issue." That phrase again. I wrote it down. Grandma said, "Did I tell you to move that money?" "You told me to take care of things for you." "That isn't what I asked. I'm not doing this over speakerphone." "You are," Grandma said, "because this is my money." I had to look down at the table to hide the reaction on my face. Dad went quiet. I could feel his strategy shifting through the silence. He had expected me to be the obstacle. He hadn't expected Grandma to sound like herself. Finally, he said, "Mom, you're making this into something it isn't. I moved money temporarily because it made sense at the time. Nothing has been lost." "If nothing has been lost," Grandma said, "put it back." "I'm working on that." That was the closest he came to admitting the account could not simply be restored with a few taps on his phone. I asked, "Is that why you called me this morning?" Dad's tone hardened again. "I called you because I thought you were capable of helping your family." "That isn't an answer. You always have to turn everything into a negotiation." "No, I turn $40,000 requests into questions." Mom's voice appeared faintly in the background again, but I couldn't make out the words. Dad said, "This is exactly what I was afraid of. You're angry about the wedding, so now you're going to make your grandmother nervous over something you don't understand." I looked at Ruth. She was no longer looking at me. She was looking at her own ledger. "I was nervous before Morgan arrived," she said. "That's why I called her." Dad ignored that. "Morgan, let me handle this." I almost laughed, but nothing about it was funny. "You've said that several times." "Because I know what I'm doing." "Then explain what you did." He refused. Not directly. Dad rarely refused directly. He layered his refusal beneath phrases like complicated, temporary, timing, family matter, unnecessary concern. He kept talking until the absence of an answer almost disappeared inside all the words around it. Grandma finally stopped him. "Robert." He went quiet. "I asked you a simple question. Did I tell you that you could invest the Harbor Pines money?" A pause. "You gave me authority to manage your finances." "That is not the question." "Mom, did I tell you to invest it?" Dad's voice dropped. "Not in those exact words." Grandma closed her eyes. I did not move. Dad continued quickly. But you told me you trusted me to make decisions when necessary. That's what the power of attorney was for. No, Grandma said. It was so you could help me do what I decided. That sentence landed harder than anything I could have said. Dad tried again. Nothing happened to your money. Then where is it? Another pause. I'll call you later. No, I said. Send Grandma the records. His patience disappeared. Stay out of this, Morgan. Grandma looked up. She is here because I asked her to be. Dad said nothing. Grandma ended the call herself. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. I wanted to tell her I was sorry. I wanted to tell her exactly what I thought Dad had done. I wanted to call the bank, freeze everything, pull every transaction, and make sure he couldn't touch another dollar before dinner. Instead, I asked, "What do you want to do next?" Grandma rested her palm on the closed ledger. "I want the bank records." "Okay. And I want Robert to explain every transfer." "Okay." She looked tired then, not confused or fragile, just tired in the way people look when someone they trusted has forced them to spend energy proving something that should never have required proof. I reached across the table, but I stopped before touching her hand. She noticed. Then she placed her hand over mine. "He's my son," she said quietly. "I know. I don't want this to be what it looks like." "I know that too." She studied my face. "Do you?" That question hurt more than I expected because I understood what she was asking. I had spent a week telling myself I didn't care that my parents had chosen Hawaii over my wedding. Grandma was asking me whether I understood what it felt like to love someone and still need to know whether they had chosen to hurt you. "Yes," I said. "I do." She looked toward the bank statement again. "If Robert didn't move that money for me," she said, "what did he move it for?" By the time I left Grandma's house that afternoon, I had 3 pages of notes and no answer I trusted. Dad had moved $40,000 out of an account Grandma had set aside for Harbor Pines. He had known Harbor Pines was calling. He had asked me for the exact amount before Grandma could look too closely at her statement. Those facts were bad enough. What I still did not know was whether he had somewhere legitimate to point when the questions got harder. That distinction mattered to me more than it probably would have to most people. I spent my working life dealing with shipments that went missing, vendors who blamed carriers who blamed warehouses, and managers who swore they had sent emails no one could find. The fastest way to make a bad situation worse was to decide what had happened before the records caught up with your anger. I had watched people lose credibility that way. Once you exaggerated one fact, the person on the other side stopped listening when you told the truth about the other 10. So when I got home, I opened a legal pad and drew a line down the middle. On the left, I wrote, "What I know." On the right, "What I don't know." Under what I knew, I wrote, Dad had access to Grandma's account. 40,000 left the Harbor Pines Reserve. Dad controlled the receiving account, or at least the account appeared to match one he had used before. Dad knew Harbor Pines had called. Dad asked me for 40,000 that same morning. Grandma did not remember authorizing an investment. Under what I didn't know, I wrote, where the money went after Dad received it. Whether Grandma had ever verbally given him broader permission. Why he moved it. Whether Mom knew. Whether Chelsea knew. Why Dad had been so certain I could replace it. I stared at that last sentence for a while. Ethan came home a little after 6, carrying takeout, and found me at the dining room table with my laptop open, the legal pad beside it, and 3 different pens arranged in a line, because apparently that was what I did when my family started unraveling. He put the bag on the counter. "You've made columns." "I like columns." "You make columns when you're trying not to feel something." "I also make columns when people move $40,000 out of Grandma's account." "That too." He took off his jacket and sat across from me. I told him what had happened after he left for work. I told him about Harbor Pines calling Dad that morning, about Grandma confirming the money had been set aside for the move, about Dad insisting he had only transferred it temporarily. Ethan listened without interrupting until I reached the part where Grandma asked for the bank records. "I'll call the bank with her tomorrow," I said. "Then I'll find an attorney who handles financial powers of attorney. I should probably call Harbor Pines too and ask them to extend the hold." Then I need to… Morgan. What? Did Ruth ask you to do all of that? She asked me to help. That wasn't my question. I hated that he sounded calm. She wants the records. Then help her get the records. And if Dad moved more, then she decides what she wants to do about it. I leaned back. You think I'm overreacting? No. Because it sounds like you think I'm overreacting. I think your father used access to your grandmother's money in a way she didn't expect, then asked you to make the number disappear before she noticed. If that's what happened, you have every reason to be furious. Good. But you keep saying, I'll call, I'll change, I'll fix. I looked away. Ethan continued. Ruth just found out her son may have used her money without permission. The last thing she needs is another person taking over because they think they know what's best. That is not what I'm doing. I know you don't mean to. That irritated me more than if he had accused me directly. I am trying to protect her. I know. Then what exactly are we arguing about? We're not arguing. I gave him a look. Fine, he said. We're having the kind of conversation where you're annoyed because I'm not telling you what you already want to hear. That was annoyingly accurate. He reached across the table and tapped the left side of my legal pad. You wrote what you know. Yes. Write one more thing. What? Grandma still gets to decide. I stared at him. Then, because I hated when he was right more than I hated admitting it, I picked up the pen. Grandma still gets to decide. The next morning, I went back to her house before work. I had deliberately left my laptop at home. I did not bring attorney names. I did not bring a list of banks to call. I did not arrive with a plan. Grandma was eating toast at the kitchen table. I have one question, I said. That usually means you have 5. Probably. She pushed the jam toward me. Go ahead. What do you want me to do? She studied me over the top of her coffee mug. Did Ethan tell you to ask me that? Maybe. I like him. I'm reconsidering it. She smiled, but only briefly. Then she said she wanted the full transaction detail from the bank. She wanted to know where the $40,000 went first. After that, she wanted to speak with the financial advisor she had used for years. She did not want me calling relatives. She did not want me confronting Chelsea. She did not want anything posted or forwarded or turned into one of those family text wars where 6 people argued about something only 2 of them understood. I want facts before everybody starts choosing sides, she said. That makes 2 of us. She looked at me as if she wasn't entirely convinced, which was fair. We called the bank together. Grandma handled the identity verification. She was the account owner, and she made the request. I sat beside her with my notebook and wrote down what she was told. The initial statement had only shown the outgoing transfer and abbreviated receiving information. The transaction detail provided more context. The transfer had been initiated through the access Dad used under the financial authority Grandma had given him. The receiving account was not some mysterious investment vehicle. It was an account under Dad's control. I felt anger move through me so quickly that I had to put my pen down. Grandma did not react immediately. She asked the bank representative to repeat the date. Then she asked whether the record showed any memo or notation explaining the transfer. There was nothing useful. When the call ended, she remained still for a while. I wanted to say, there, now we know. But we didn't. We knew Dad moved the money to himself. We still did not know why. I wrote it exactly that way. Grandma watched me. You're very careful with your words today. I'm practicing. That bad? Apparently. She reached for her phone. I want Robert to explain this. Do you want me here? Yes. Dad answered after several rings. Grandma started this time. I have the transfer detail. Silence. Then Dad said, okay. It went to your account. Another pause. Yes. You told Morgan yesterday you moved it somewhere it could be managed better. That's still true. I wrote that down. Grandma's mouth tightened. Your checking account is not an investment. It didn't stay there. That was new. I looked at Grandma. She asked, where did it go? I'm dealing with something. You keep saying that, because that's what happened. What happened? Dad's tone changed. Mom, I am not going to discuss every financial decision I make with Morgan sitting there taking notes. I looked at the pen in my hand. He knew me too well. Grandma said, Then discuss my financial decision with me. I was trying to protect you from unnecessary stress. You moved $40,000 out of my account, and I said I would replace it. That sentence hit me harder than it should have. Replace it. I circled the word without thinking. At the time, I still didn't understand how important it would become. I said, Dad, if this is legitimate, show Grandma the records. This does not involve you. She asked me to help. You're enjoying this. I actually laughed once, because the accusation was so far from the truth. Do you think I wanted to spend the week after my wedding asking why you moved Grandma's money? You wanted a reason to be angry. No, you gave me one. Grandma raised a hand. I stopped. She said, Robert, did I tell you to move $40,000 to your account? We've already been through this. No, you've talked around it. I had authority to manage your finances. That isn't what I asked. Dad exhaled. You told me to take care of things while you were recovering. Grandma's voice stayed level. Did I tell you to move the Harbor Pines money? Not specifically. There it was again. Not specifically. Not yes. Not no. A phrase designed to occupy the space between them. Dad continued before Grandma could answer. You trusted me to make practical decisions. I made one. The money isn't gone. Nothing has happened to it. I looked at the bank detail. It had gone somewhere. Grandma asked, Can you return all $40,000 today? Dad did not answer. That was the second answer he gave us. Finally, he said, I'm arranging it. Grandma closed her eyes for a moment. I felt the old instinct rise in me immediately. Call the bank. Lock everything down. Find an attorney. Fix it before Dad had another hour. I saw Ethan's handwriting in my head, though of course it was mine. Grandma still gets to decide. So instead I asked, Grandma, what do you want to do? Dad snapped. Stop coaching her. Grandma's eyes opened. She asked me a question. She's putting ideas in your head. No, Robert, she's asking what I want. Dad tried to soften his voice. Mom, this is exactly why I didn't want Morgan involved. She's upset about the wedding and she's turning a temporary financial issue into some kind of investigation. I looked at Grandma, but I said nothing. She answered him herself. If this is temporary, show me where the money is. Dad went silent. Robert, I'll call you later. Grandma ended the call before he could. For a few seconds, she just stared at the phone. Then she said, He keeps telling me not to worry. I waited. That makes me worry. We called her financial advisor next. I had met the man twice over the years, both times at family events, and remembered almost nothing about him except that he wore conservative ties and never stayed long. His name was Daniel Mercer. Grandma had worked with him for more than a decade on retirement accounts, cash reserves, and the slow transition from the house she owned outright to whatever came next. Grandma explained the situation herself. Daniel did not immediately say Dad had done anything illegal. I appreciated that. He asked when the transfer happened, which account it left, and whether Grandma had instructed Robert to move the reserve. Grandma said no. Then he went quiet. I need to look at something, he said. What? Grandma asked. I remember Robert asking me about that reserve. My pen stopped. When? I don't want to guess. Let me pull the email. We waited while he searched. I could hear keyboard clicks through the speaker. Then he said, I have it. Grandma looked at me. Daniel read the date, April 29th. 2 days before my wedding. I wrote it down. What did he ask? Grandma said. He asked whether the money you'd earmarked for Harbor Pines needed to remain in that exact account, or whether it could be temporarily moved without affecting your plan. My stomach tightened. What did you tell him? I asked. Daniel paused. I told him that from a planning perspective, the important issue was liquidity and preserving the funds for their intended purpose. I did not tell him he could use the money for something else. Did he tell you he intended to move it to his own account? Grandma asked. No. Did he tell you why he was asking? No. I assumed he was asking about cash management because he was assisting you. That mattered too. Daniel had not been sitting on a secret. Dad had asked a question broad enough to sound administrative. Grandma said, Did I know about that email? Not that I'm aware of. Daniel offered to forward it to her. Please do. When it arrived, Grandma opened it on her tablet and handed it to me. Dad's wording was careful. He did not say, "Can I take Mom's $40,000? He did not say, "Can I use it for Chelsea?" He asked whether the reserve had to remain segregated in the current account, or whether there was flexibility to temporarily reposition the cash while maintaining availability. It sounded like something written by a man who wanted an answer he could later stretch. I read Daniel's reply. Keep the funds liquid. Preserve them for Ruth's stated purpose. No approval. No instruction to move them. Just a general answer to a general question. I checked the timestamp again. April 29th. That evening, I went home and added the email to my timeline. April 29th. Dad asks about moving Harbor Pines Reserve. May 1st. My wedding. May 1st through the following week. Mom and Dad in Hawaii with Chelsea's family. May 8th. Harbor Pines calls Dad. May 8th. Dad asks me for $40,000. May 8th. Grandma sees $40,000 missing. I sat there looking at the sequence. Ethan came up behind me and rested a hand on my shoulder. You found something. I found a date. That bad? Maybe. I turned the laptop so he could see the email. He was asking about Grandma's reserve before the wedding. Ethan read it twice. That doesn't say why. No. It doesn't say where it went. No. It doesn't prove he planned anything. No. He looked at me. I pointed to the legal pad. What I know, what I don't. He smiled faintly. I'm proud of you. Don't be. I hate this. That's usually when doing it right matters. I looked back at the timeline. 2 days after Dad asked whether Grandma's $40,000 could be moved, Mom called me and confirmed they were going to Hawaii instead of my wedding. At the time, I had treated those as separate insults. My parents choosing Chelsea, Dad asking me for money, Grandma's missing reserve. Now, for the first time, they sat on one page. I still could not prove the $40,000 had paid for Hawaii. I could not prove Chelsea knew anything. I could not prove Mom had known where Dad got the money. But I no longer believed Dad had stumbled into some emergency after the trip. He had been looking at Grandma's reserve before he ever got on the plane. I called Chelsea 2 days after Grandma's advisor forwarded the email. I waited that long because I wanted to be sure I was calling with a question, not an accusation. There was a difference, and by then I had started to understand how quickly my family could turn that difference against me. I had the transfer from Grandma's reserve. I had the date Dad asked whether that reserve could be moved. I had the fact that he had flown to Hawaii 2 days later. What I did not have was proof that a single dollar of Grandma's money had paid for the trip. If I called Chelsea and told her Dad had stolen from Grandma to fund her vacation, I would be saying more than the records supported. Dad would seize on that immediately. Mom would repeat it to everyone she knew. By the end of the day, the story would no longer be about $40,000 leaving Grandma's account. It would be about Morgan making wild accusations because her parents missed her wedding. So I opened my notebook, wrote one question at the top of the page, and called my sister. Who paid for Hawaii? Chelsea was quiet long enough that I wondered whether the call had dropped. Then she said, "What?" "The trip. Flights, the villa. Everything." "Who paid?" "Mom and Dad." "With what?" Her answer came faster this time. "Are you serious?" "Yes." "You call me out of nowhere and ask where Mom and Dad got vacation money?" "I'm asking who paid." "You already know who paid." "They did." "That's not the same question." I heard movement on her end, then a door close. Chelsea had 2 children, and whenever she wanted privacy, she either went into her bedroom or locked herself in the laundry room. I had learned that from years of receiving frantic phone calls punctuated by dryers, cabinet doors, and somebody asking for a snack. "What exactly are you doing, Morgan?" she asked. "Trying to understand something." "No, you're not. You're angry they didn't come to your wedding." "I am angry they didn't come to my wedding." She stopped. I think she had expected me to deny it. I continued. "That doesn't change what I'm asking. You've been waiting for a reason to punish them." There it was again. Dad had used almost the same line. It was convenient for all of them, because my anger about the wedding was real. If they could make that the cause of everything I did afterward, then they never had to answer whether what I discovered was true. I said, Grandma is missing $40,000. Chelsea didn't speak. Dad moved it. Another silence. Did you hear me? Yes. He moved it before the wedding. What do you mean, moved it? I mean $40,000 left Grandma's Harbor Pines reserve and went into an account Dad controls. Chelsea's voice dropped. Why would he do that? I don't know yet. You just said. I said what I know. I don't know where it went after that. Then why are you calling me? Because 2 days after Dad asked Grandma's advisor whether that reserve could be moved, he and Mom flew to Hawaii with you. So I'm asking again. Who paid for the trip? Chelsea exhaled sharply. Dad did. All of it? Most of it, I think. You think? The flights, the place we stayed, activities. Mom paid for some meals. I wasn't keeping receipts. Did Ryan pay anything? Not much. Did you? No. That answer was so simple that it made me grip my pen harder. Chelsea said, Before you start, they offered. I haven't started. I know how you get. I almost asked what that meant, then decided I already knew. Chelsea had always experienced questions as judgment when the questions led somewhere she did not want to go. I said, How did Dad say he was paying? He said he had points. Enough points for 6 people? 4 adults and 2 kids. Chelsea. Fine, he said, points and savings. I didn't ask for an accounting. That phrase landed badly after the week I had been having. Did Ryan think it was points too? Yes. Did you ever see the points? What kind of question is that? A literal one. No. I did not log into Dad's airline account and inspect his points balance. Did he book the flights? Yes. The villa? I think so. You think so, or he did? I don't know, Morgan. Dad sent us confirmations. We packed. We went. Normal people do not conduct forensic audits before accepting a family vacation. I'm not asking what normal people do. Obviously. I closed my eyes for a second. That was the moment I nearly lost the conversation. I could feel myself moving from information to resentment, and Chelsea could feel it too. It would have been easy to say something cruel about adults accepting expensive trips while carrying debt. It would also have been premature, because I still did not know about the debt. At that point, all I knew was that Chelsea was defensive, and Dad had paid. So I changed direction. Did anything about the trip feel strange to you? Other than you not speaking to Mom? I was speaking to Mom. She was the one posting beach pictures during my rehearsal dinner. Chelsea went quiet. I regretted the sentence as soon as I said it. Not because it was untrue, but because it gave her an exit. Morgan, I'm not doing this. Okay, I mean it. I heard you. You've hated me for years because Mom helps me more. That stopped me. I don't hate you. You act like everything I have was handed to me. Was Hawaii? She hung up. I stared at my phone for several seconds, then placed it face down on the table. I was angry with her. I was angry with myself for handing her the easiest possible reason to end the call. I had wanted facts and let one old wound turn the conversation into exactly what Dad and Mom said it was. Ethan found me that evening reading the same page in my notebook without adding anything to it. How'd it go? She hung up. So well. I asked who paid. Dad did. That's something. She says points and savings. Could be. Yes. You don't sound convinced. I'm not convinced of anything. That's the problem. I told him about the call, including the part where I asked if Hawaii had been handed to her. That one probably didn't help, he said. No. True? Also not the point. He nodded. I hated when he let me arrive at my own criticism. I keep wanting her to be guilty, I admitted. Why? Because if she knew, it would make everything simpler. Would it? Yes. Dad takes the money. Mom helps him. Chelsea benefits. Everyone knew except Grandma and me. Very clean. And if she didn't know? Then I have to figure out what she did know. Ethan sat beside me. That sounds harder. It is. I was still thinking about that the next afternoon when a number I recognized as Ryan's appeared on my phone. He and I did not speak often outside birthdays and family gatherings. We liked each other well enough, but we were not the kind of in-laws who traded memes or called just to talk. Hey, I answered. Do you have a minute? Yes. He sounded uncomfortable. Chelsea told me you called her about Hawaii. I waited. She said you think your dad used Ruth's money for the trip. I told her 40,000 left Grandma's account and went to Dad. I told her I'm trying to figure out where it went after that. So you don't know it paid for Hawaii? No. Okay. His relief surprised me. I asked, why? Because I'm trying to understand what's true too. There was something in his voice that made me sit down. Chelsea said Dad paid for most of it. I said, he did. How do you know? Because I have the confirmations. That got my attention. Ryan explained that Dad had booked the villa under a reservation that included all 6 names, and because Ryan had been listed as one of the adult guests, he received copies of the booking emails. Dad had also forwarded the airline itinerary after buying the tickets. Can you send them to me? He hesitated. I'm not putting anything online, I said. I'm not sending them to relatives. Grandma is trying to understand what happened to her money. That's not what Chelsea thinks. I know. And your mom called me yesterday? That was new. What did she say? That you're trying to drag everybody into a fight because they skipped the wedding. I felt my jaw tighten. What did you tell her? That I wasn't interested in being in the middle. Smart. Didn't work. Despite everything, I almost laughed. Ryan went quiet, then said, I'll send the confirmations if you keep them between you, Ruth, and whoever she's using to review this. I will. Good. A few minutes later, 2 emails appeared. The first was the villa. I had expected expensive. I had not expected that expensive. It was a high-end property large enough for 4 adults and 2 children, with multiple bedrooms, private outdoor space, and resort services attached to the reservation. The total did not account for every cost of the trip, but it was enough to make me understand why Mom had posted so many photographs. Dad's name was listed as the payer. The second confirmation covered the flights. Dad again. I printed both and laid them beside the timeline. Then I did something that had become almost ritual by that point. I wrote what they proved. Dad paid the villa. Dad paid the flights. They did not prove Grandma paid the villa. They did not prove Grandma paid the flights. That distinction was frustrating, because emotionally the story already looked obvious. 40,000 had left Grandma's reserve. Dad had received it. Then Dad had spent thousands on Hawaii, but money inside an account did not come with labels once it was mixed with other money. If Dad already had $20,000 of his own sitting there, I could not point at a villa payment and declare those exact dollars belonged to Grandma. I called Ruth and told her what Ryan had sent me. So he paid, she said. Yes. With my money? I can't say that yet. Why not? Because the booking shows Dad paid. It doesn't show which dollars he used. Ruth was quiet. I added, It matters. I know. That was one of the things I loved most about her. She did not ask me to make uncertainty disappear because certainty would feel better. That evening, Ryan called again. I need to ask you something, he said. Okay. When did the money leave Ruth's account? I gave him the date. He went quiet. What? That was before the trip. Yes. Another silence. Ryan? I need to talk to Chelsea. I felt the hairs along my arms lift. About what? He did not answer immediately. Finally, he said, Something else was happening before Hawaii. I waited. I don't know how much of it is mine to tell you. That's fair. But if your dad used Ruth's money, I need to know whether any of it went toward us. Toward you how? Ryan exhaled. Ask Chelsea. That was all he would say. I did not call her that night. For once, I let the question sit. Chelsea called me the next morning. Her voice sounded different. Not angry. Tired. Ryan told me he talked to you. Yes. He sent you the reservations. Yes. Great. I told him I wouldn't share them outside Grandma's review. That's not what I meant. I waited. She sighed. You asked me if anything about Hawaii felt strange. Yes. There was a reason we went. I assumed the reason was Mom wanted to skip my wedding in a prettier location. That's not fair. Probably not. Another pause. Then Chelsea said, Ryan and I were having problems. That was not news in the broadest sense. Most married couples had problems. But in our family, Chelsea and Ryan had always been presented as the successful unit. Christmas cards, family photos, school events, Matching sweaters one year that I still had not forgiven them for. Mom talked about their marriage. The way people talked about a house they wanted everyone to know had recently been remodeled. What kind of problems? Money. I looked down at my notebook. How bad? Chelsea hesitated. Bad enough that Ryan found a credit card he didn't know about. Your card? Yes. How much? I'm not discussing every number with you. Fine. He found a balance. We had a huge fight. He asked whether there were any other accounts he didn't know about. Were there? Her silence answered first. Yes, she said. How many? Morgan, you don't have to tell me. I know. I heard her breathing. Then she said, more than one. I leaned back in my chair. When did Ryan find out? A few weeks before your wedding. There it was. What happened? He said no more surprises. He said if there was another account, another loan, anything else I hadn't told him about, we had a much bigger problem than money. And Mom knew? I called her. Of course she did. What did she do? What Mom always does. Take over? Chelsea ignored that. She said everybody was stressed. She said Ryan and I needed to get out of the house, get away from bills and work and everything, spend time with the kids, remember what mattered. Hawaii. Yes. On my wedding weekend. I didn't pick the date. You still went. I know. That answer took some of the fight out of me. I asked, did Dad know about the debt? Some of it? How much? I don't know what Mom told him. Did he give you money before the trip? Chelsea did not answer. I felt my grip tighten around the phone. Chelsea. Dad helped with a few things. What things? Payments. What payments? One card. A personal loan payment. A couple things that were coming due. How much? I don't know exactly. You don't know how much money Dad gave you? I know what bills got paid. I don't know what account he paid them from. The wording caught my attention. What account? I didn't mean a specific account. Did you see him paying them? No. Then what happened? Chelsea told me that Dad had asked her to send him information for a few payments. She did. He told her he would buy them some breathing room while she and Ryan sorted things out. Ryan did not know Dad was helping with all of it. I stopped writing. So Dad helped you hide debt from Ryan, after Ryan explicitly told you there could be no more financial surprises. Chelsea's voice sharpened. That is not how it felt at the time. How did it feel? Like my marriage was falling apart. That doesn't change what happened. I know that now. The word now mattered. What did you think then? I thought if I could get through a month without another explosion, I could fix it. I understood that logic more than I wanted to. Not because I would have made the same decision, but because the structure was familiar. Delay the bad thing. Solve it before anyone sees. Make the number disappear. Restore the surface before someone asks what happened underneath. Dad's logic. Maybe Chelsea had learned more from him than either of them realized. I said, was Hawaii Dad's idea? Mom's. Why that weekend? She said it was the only time the villa was available at the rate she wanted. I let the silence stretch. Chelsea sighed. I know. Do you? Yes, Morgan. I know it was your wedding. And you went. Yes. I wanted to ask why my milestone had been the easiest thing to sacrifice, but that question belonged to Mom and Dad more than it belonged to Chelsea. And I was beginning to see that if I asked every question as soon as I felt it, I would never get to the ones that mattered most. So I asked, when did you first think Dad might be using Grandma's money? Chelsea stopped breathing for half a second. It was tiny, but I heard it. I didn't. That wasn't what I asked. I didn't know he was. Neither did I. She said nothing. Chelsea, did anything happen in Hawaii that made you wonder? I told you no. You paused. Oh my God. Fine. Then tell me there was nothing. Silence. I waited. Finally, she said, I heard Mom say something. I picked up my pen. When? I don't remember the exact day. Maybe the second night. What did she say? It wasn't a whole conversation. What did you hear? Chelsea's voice dropped. I got up after the kids were asleep. Mom and Dad were talking in the kitchen. I wasn't trying to listen. I didn't ask whether you were. She said, Ruth won't need it yet. I stopped writing. For a moment, neither of us spoke. What did Dad say? I don't know. You heard Mom mention Grandma and didn't ask what she meant? It could have meant anything. Did you think it meant anything? Chelsea became defensive again. Grandma had just had surgery. Mom talked about helping her all the time. Then why do you remember the sentence? No answer. That was the problem. People rarely remembered harmless fragments from ordinary conversations weeks later, unless something about them had felt wrong when they heard them. What else did you hear? Nothing clear. Nothing about money? No. Harbor Pines? No. Me? No. Did you ask Mom later? No. Dad? No. Why? Chelsea exhaled, and when she spoke again, the anger was gone. Because I didn't want to know. I looked down at the words on my page. What do you mean? I mean, I knew Dad was spending more than I expected. He paid for the flights. He paid for the villa. He helped me with those bills. Mom kept saying they could afford it. Ryan thought everything was fine because he believed Dad had savings and points and whatever else. Then I heard Mom say Grandma wouldn't need it yet. Her voice started to shake. But she kept going. I knew there was a question there. And you didn't ask. No. Because? Because if I asked, and the answer was bad, then what? We leave Hawaii? I tell Ryan my parents are paying bills he doesn't know about? I call Grandma and ask if Dad took her money? My marriage was already hanging by a thread. So you decided not knowing was better. At the time? Yes. I closed my eyes. I had expected to feel triumphant if Chelsea admitted something. I didn't. I felt tired. You told me yesterday you didn't know. I didn't. You suspected. That's not the same thing. No, it isn't. She seemed surprised, I agreed. I continued. But suspicion creates a choice. What choice? Ask or don't ask. That's easy for you to say. Why? Because your life is always under control. I nearly laughed. My father may have taken $40,000 from Grandma and asked me to replace it before she noticed. That is exactly what I mean. You find a problem and turn it into a list. You call people. You ask for documents. You know what to do. No, Chelsea. I know what to do next. That's not the same as knowing how everything ends. She went quiet. I was scared, she said. I believe you. I thought if Ryan saw everything at once, he'd leave. That still might happen. I know. And Dad paying things without Ryan knowing didn't fix that. I know. I'm not going to tell you this is all your fault. Thank you. But I'm also not going to tell you you had no responsibility. Her breathing changed. You heard enough to know there was something you didn't want to understand. I know. That was the first time in the entire conversation she did not defend herself. I asked her to send me whatever records she had of payments Dad made on her behalf. No. I expected the answer. Okay. You're not angry. I am. But they're your records. She was quiet. If Grandma's accounting shows Dad used her money for those payments, I said, you're going to have to decide what you do with that. I know. And Ryan? Another silence. He knows I hid debt, she said. He doesn't know every payment Dad made. That's between you and Ryan. Mom says telling him everything now will just make things worse. I felt something cold settle in me. Mom would? What's that supposed to mean? It means Mom seems very interested in problems staying invisible until somebody else can fix them. That's not fair. Maybe. I had learned to say maybe when I was angry. It was useful. It gave the truth room to catch up. After we hung up, I called Grandma and told her only what Chelsea had given me permission to share about the trip and the sentence she had heard. Grandma was quiet for a long time. She heard Linda say my name? Yes. And she didn't ask? No. Grandma Sahil. I could hear disappointment in it, but not surprise. She was scared, I said. So were you when your parents missed your wedding. I didn't know where Grandma was going with that, she continued. Being scared explains a lot of foolish things. It doesn't make them wise. I wrote that down too. Later that afternoon, Ryan sent me one more email. It contained nothing dramatic, just the updated reservation summary and a short message confirming again that Robert had paid the villa and flights directly. He wrote that he was reviewing his own family finances and would share anything relevant with Ruth if Chelsea agreed or if Ruth's attorney formally needed it. I respected that. No one needed to turn the family into a surveillance operation. By the end of that week, My timeline was fuller, but still incomplete. I could show that Dad had moved Grandma's $40,000 into an account he controlled. I could show he had been thinking about that reserve before the trip. I could show he personally paid major Hawaii expenses. I knew he had also made payments connected to Chelsea's debt. I knew Chelsea had heard Mom say, "Ruth won't need it yet." What I still could not show was exactly which dollars had gone where. That would take records Dad had not yet provided. But the larger picture had changed. Hawaii was no longer just the vacation my parents chose instead of my wedding. It was a rescue mission. Ryan had discovered debt. Chelsea was afraid her marriage was collapsing. Mom decided the family needed to rally around her. Dad found money. Bills were paid. Flights were booked. A villa was reserved. Everyone flew thousands of miles away and posted photographs of sunsets, while my grandmother's $40,000 reserve sat empty. And somewhere inside that week, my mother had looked at whatever Dad was doing and said 5 words Chelsea remembered, because even she knew they sounded wrong. Ruth won't need it yet. The question was no longer whether Chelsea had known everything. She hadn't. The harder truth was that she had known enough to ask, and she had decided she could not afford the answer. Chelsea called me again 2 days later, and this time she did not start by accusing me of ruining the family. She started with a number. "It's more than 50,000, she said. I was sitting in my office during lunch with the door closed. Halfway through a sandwich, I suddenly had no interest in eating. For a second, I thought she meant Dad's 40,000. Then she said, "The debt, mine, not the mortgage." I put the sandwich down. "How much more than 50? She let out a tired breath. "I'm still figuring that out." That answer told me more than a precise total would have. People who know what they owe give you a number. People who say they are still figuring it out usually mean they spent a long time making sure they never had to see the whole number at once. Chelsea told me there were several credit cards, the personal loan she had already mentioned, and a balance on a store financing account Ryan did not know existed. None of it came from one spectacular purchase. That almost made it worse. There was no diamond bracelet, no sports car, no single reckless weekend she could point to and say, "There." That was the mistake. It had accumulated through school expenses for the kids, furniture they bought before they had finished paying for the old furniture, vacations they could technically afford if nothing else went wrong, clothes, dinners, home improvements, and the 1,000 little purchases people make when they are trying to maintain a life they have already told everyone they can afford. "How did Ryan not know?" I asked. "We split some things. That doesn't explain $50,000. I know. Did you hide statements?" "Yes." "Change passwords?" A pause. "On 2 accounts." I leaned back in my chair. I wanted to say something sharp. Instead, I asked, "Why?" "Because every month I thought I'd get it under control before he noticed." "Did you?" "Obviously not." There was no self-pity in the answer, which was probably why I stayed quiet. Chelsea said Ryan had discovered one card because a promotional rate ended and the minimum payment jumped. An email appeared on a shared tablet. He clicked it because he assumed it was spam or a mistake. By the end of that night, he knew there was debt she had never told him about, but he did not yet know how much. "What did he say?" He asked me one question. "What? Is there anything else?" I waited. Chelsea's voice lowered. And I said no. That was worse than the hidden card. She knew it too. "Then you called Mom?" "Yes." "What did you tell her?" "That Ryan had found one account and was furious." "Did you tell her there were others?" "Not all of them." "So even Mom didn't know everything." "No." That mattered. It made the family disaster less neat, but more believable. Everyone had been operating with a different version of the truth. Ryan knew there was hidden debt. Chelsea knew there was more. Mom knew Chelsea's marriage was in danger, but not necessarily the full total. Dad knew enough to start paying bills, and Grandma knew none of it while her reserve disappeared. I asked Chelsea when Mom decided they should go to Hawaii. Almost immediately. Immediately? Within a day. Of course she did. Chelsea continued before I could say anything. She said Ryan and I were spiraling. She said we needed to stop talking about money for 48 hours and remember why we were married in the first place. For an entire trip to Hawaii, You know, Mom. Yes. She said she and Dad would cover it. Did Dad agree right away? No. That was the first time Chelsea had ever told me that. What happened? I don't know everything they said. I wasn't sitting there taking notes. Tell me what you do know. She was quiet for a moment. There was an argument in Hawaii between Mom and Dad. When? The first couple of days. You heard it? Some of it. I picked up my pen. Chelsea heard the movement. Morgan, don't turn every sentence into evidence. I'm writing down what you tell me so I don't misremember it. That is exactly what I mean. Then don't tell me anything you don't want remembered accurately. She muttered something under her breath. What did you hear? Chelsea hesitated long enough that I wondered if she had changed her mind. Then she said, Dad said, I told you this was Morgan's wedding weekend. My hand stopped. For days I had been trying to convince myself that maybe Dad had simply gone along with Mom's plan. That maybe he had mentally separated the two things. Chelsea's crisis over here, my wedding over there. An unfortunate scheduling conflict nobody had intentionally created. Chelsea erased that possibility with one sentence. He said my name? Yes. And Mom? Chelsea did not answer immediately. I knew before she spoke that whatever came next was going to hurt. She said, Morgan will be fine. Chelsea isn't. I stared at the blank space below the words I had already written. Morgan will be fine. Chelsea isn't. I had heard versions of that sentence my entire life, but never so nakedly. You're sure? Yes. You remember those exact words? Yes. How? Chelsea's voice tightened. Because I knew what weekend it was, too. That landed differently. I had spent days imagining Chelsea floating through Hawaii without thinking about me at all. Apparently, that had not been true either. What happened after Mom said it? I walked away. Why? Because they were arguing about me. About the debt? Some of it. And you didn't want to hear. No. There was that pattern again. Chelsea had built an entire life around not opening doors if she was afraid of what stood behind them. I asked, Did Dad say he didn't want to go? I don't know. Did he defend me? I heard him say it was your wedding weekend. That isn't the same thing. I know. I could not decide which part hurt more. That Dad had remembered, or that remembering had not changed what he did. For years, I had told myself my parents missed things because Chelsea's emergencies were louder. It was easier to believe they simply got swept up. But Dad had stood in a villa in Hawaii and said the conflict out loud. He knew exactly what they had chosen. Mom had answered with the rule that governed our family. Morgan will be fine. Chelsea isn't. I thanked Chelsea for telling me. She sounded surprised. That's it? What do you want me to say? I don't know. I'm not going to punish you for giving me information I asked for. There was a short silence. Then she said, You're already punishing everyone. I felt the old irritation rise but kept my voice level. By doing what? By pushing this. Grandma wants to know where her money went. I mean the wedding too. You just told me Mom and Dad discussed my wedding while they were in Hawaii. That wasn't me dragging it into this. Chelsea had no answer. Before we hung up, I asked her whether she had started giving Ryan the full picture. I'm working on it. That means no. It means I'm working on it. Chelsea, do not do the older sister voice. I don't have an older sister voice. You absolutely do. I almost smiled. Then she said, I told him about 2 more cards. Only 2? I said I'm working on it. I let it go because, for once, it truly was not mine to fix. Over the next several days, Grandma began receiving more transaction information through the review she had requested. Nothing arrived all at once. There was no dramatic spreadsheet labeled "Money Stolen from Ruth." There were individual transfers, payment dates, account movements, and enough overlapping numbers to make my eyes hurt if I stared too long. Dad still had not voluntarily explained the full path of the $40,000. He kept insisting the money had been temporarily repositioned and that everyone was making a manageable situation worse. What the records did begin to show was timing. The $40,000 entered an account Dad controlled. Large payments followed. Ryan had already confirmed the villa and flights. Chelsea, after several uncomfortable conversations with Ryan, provided Ruth with records showing that Dad had also paid one of her credit cards and covered a payment on the personal loan shortly before or during the Hawaii trip. I refused to write a sentence in my notes saying, "Grandma's money paid Chelsea's card." I wrote, "Dad received Grandma's money. Dad paid Chelsea's obligations afterward. Source attribution still pending complete accounting." It felt almost absurdly cautious, but caution had become the one thing Dad could not argue with. One afternoon, Grandma asked why I kept separating facts that looked so obviously connected. "Because obvious isn't the same as proven. You think Robert will use that distinction? I think Dad will use any distinction he can find." She nodded once. Fair. I was beginning to understand that the more emotional the truth became, the more disciplined I had to be with the evidence. Ryan called me late that week. He sounded exhausted. "I gave Chelsea some space," he said. "I'm at my brother's place for a few nights. I did not ask if they were separating. That word belonged to them. I'm sorry." "Thanks." He paused. "I asked her for everything. All the accounts? All of them. Cards, loans, anything I haven't seen. I waited. And she says she's getting it together. That sounds like Chelsea." "Yeah." There was no affection in the word, but there was still familiarity. Ryan continued. "I told her there are no more bailouts. Not from your parents, not from anyone. I need to know what our life actually costs before I decide anything." That was probably the smartest thing anyone in our family had said all month. "Good," I said. He laughed once without humor. "It doesn't feel good." "No. I'm not calling you to make you pick sides. I won't. I just wanted you to know, because if your dad paid more of our bills than I knew about, it may show up in whatever Ruth is reviewing." "I understand." He went quiet. Then he said, "Your mom thinks I'm overreacting." That did not surprise me. "What did she say?" "That marriages survive worse things." "They do." "She said I should focus on why Chelsea hid the debt instead of the fact that she hid it." "That sounds like Mom too." Ryan sighed. "I don't know how your family does this." "Does what?" "Turns consequences into cruelty." I did not have an answer for him then. Later, I realized he had described something I had spent 38 years accepting. In my family, the person who caused the crisis was often treated as fragile. The person who refused to absorb the crisis became the difficult one. Chelsea overspent, so we were supposed to understand how scared she was. Dad moved Grandma's money, so we were supposed to understand how hard he had been trying to help. Mom skipped my wedding, so I was supposed to understand that Chelsea needed her more. If I said no, if Ryan asked for records, if Grandma demanded her money back, suddenly our boundaries became the harshest thing happening in the room. That was when something I had believed about my childhood began to shift. For most of my life, I had described the problem as favoritism. Mom favored Chelsea. Dad protected Chelsea. Chelsea was the golden child. Those statements were not entirely wrong, but they were too simple. Chelsea was not rewarded because she was inherently more lovable. She was rewarded because she generated need. And my family worshipped need. Need gave Mom a job. Need gave Dad authority. Need gave Chelsea protection. I had built myself in the opposite direction. At 16, if I forgot something for school, I figured out how to manage without it. At 19, when my checking account dropped lower than I expected, I skipped dinners out instead of asking my parents for money. At 23, when my car died, I took a bus until I bought another. At 29, when I changed jobs and spent 6 weeks terrified I had made a mistake, I told my parents only after the new position worked out. Every time I solved something alone, Mom praised me. "You're so independent. You've always been responsible. You don't need us hovering." I thought I was earning respect. What I was actually earning was exemption from care. Chelsea got rescue. I got confidence. Confidence sounded better until you needed somebody to show up. The wedding had made that impossible to ignore. My parents did not miss it because they forgot the date. Dad remembered. They did not miss it because Hawaii had been booked months earlier. The crisis came only weeks before. They made a choice. Chelsea's marriage was in danger. Mine was beginning. One event was treated as urgent because it contained fear. The other was treated as optional because it contained happiness. Mom had put the whole philosophy into 5 words. Morgan will be fine. I hated how much those words explained. I was sitting with Grandma at her dining room table the following Sunday when she asked me a question that turned the story in a direction I had not expected. She had the blue ledger beside her but had not opened it. The newer bank records were organized in a folder. She had become quieter about Dad over the previous few days, not softer. At first, I worried she was shutting down. Then I realized she was thinking. Has your father ever asked you for money before? I looked up from the page I was reading. What? Money. Has Robert borrowed from you? Yes. How often? Not often. When? I tried to remember. A few years ago. The roof. What roof? His roof. Grandma frowned. Dad called me and said they had a problem with water getting in near the back of the house. Insurance wasn't covering all of it. He needed $12,000 quickly. Did he repay you? Eventually. How long? I don't remember. Several months. Grandma was staring at me in a way I did not like. What? Anything else? I looked toward the window, thinking. There was the tax issue. What tax issue? He said they owed more than expected 1 year, and he didn't want to pull money out of an investment at the wrong time. How much? $8,000. Did he repay that? Yes. When? I don't know. Grandma pulled the yellow legal pad toward her. When did these things happen? I don't remember exact dates. Your bank will. I stared at her. She said, Bring me the dates. I understood why before I wanted to. No. Grandma's expression did not change. I mean, I can get them. I just don't know what you think we're going to find. I don't know either. Dad borrowed money from me. He paid it back. That doesn't mean. I didn't say it meant anything. That stopped me. She was using my own rule against me. Facts first. I smiled despite myself. You've been listening. You talk a lot. I do not. You do when you're nervous. I opened my banking app, but the records did not go back far enough through the simple search. I would need to pull archived statements. Do you remember approximately which years? Grandma asked. The roof was about 3 years ago. The tax thing, maybe the year after. Find the exact dates. Why? She looked at the folder containing her records. Because I want to know whether Robert has moved money from me before. The sentence made the room feel colder. What makes you think he has? I don't think it. Grandma, I'm asking. Why now? She rested both hands on the table. Because your father did not call a bank when he needed to replace my money. I waited. He called you. That was the first time I really considered what that meant beyond the insult of it. Dad had not called a lender. He had not sold something. He had not asked Grandma for time. He had not even started with Chelsea, whose crisis had apparently consumed most of the money. He called me. Immediately. As if he already knew the solution. Grandma said, People repeat what works. I did not answer. That night, after Ethan went to bed, I sat at our dining room table and downloaded old statements. The first transfer was easy to find once I knew the approximate year. $12,000. I remembered the conversation when I saw the date. Dad had called on a Tuesday afternoon. He said a contractor needed a deposit before repairs could continue. I had asked fewer questions then. $12,000 had been uncomfortable but manageable, and Dad had sounded embarrassed enough that I believed asking for details would humiliate him. I transferred it the next morning. The $8,000 took longer to find. That one had been framed as a timing issue with taxes. Dad said he had the assets, but did not want to liquidate something under bad conditions. He promised it would be temporary. Temporary. I stared at that word in my memory. Both times he had repaid me. That was what I kept telling myself. He repaid me. He repaid me. I had never thought to ask what happened between the day my money entered his account and the day it came back. I printed the statements and took them to Grandma the next morning. She already had several years of her own account history available from the records she had requested. We sat side by side. Roof first, she said. I gave her the date. She moved through her statements slowly. Nothing that day. Nothing the day before. Nothing the next day. I almost felt relieved. Then Grandma stopped. 3 days after my transfer, there was a deposit into one of her accounts. From Robert. The amount was close enough to make my stomach turn. Not identical. Close. I stared at it. That could be anything. Yes, Grandma said. He could have owed you money. Yes. You probably have it in the ledger. Maybe. Neither of us moved toward the blue book. Not yet. Tax, Grandma said. I gave her the second date. We repeated the process. This time, the gap was longer. My $8,000 went to Dad. Within the same stretch of days, another payment from Dad appeared in Grandma's records. Again, not an exact match. Again, close enough to create the question neither of us wanted. I sat back. This still doesn't prove anything. No, he could have been paying you back for something unrelated. Yes. The numbers don't even match exactly. No. I looked at her. You're being very agreeable. I'm waiting for you to finish arguing with yourself. I looked back at the dates. There were only 2 examples. 2 was not a system. 2 could be coincidence. 2 could be ordinary family money moving around at the same time. I knew all of that. I also knew Dad had called me for $40,000 the morning Grandma was about to notice $40,000 missing. For the first time, I stopped thinking about that call as an isolated act of desperation. I started wondering whether it was a reflex. Grandma touched one of the old statements. Did Robert ever tell you what happened after you sent this? The roof got fixed. Did you see the invoice? I looked at her. No. And the taxes? No. Did he show you what he owed? No. I felt embarrassed, which irritated me because I had not done anything wrong. I had trusted my father. That should not have required an apology. Still, I heard myself say, I should have asked. Grandma shook her head. He should have told you. That distinction mattered too. I gathered my 2 statements and aligned them with hers. I had begun the week trying to determine whether Dad used Grandma's money to fund Hawaii and rescue Chelsea. Now, I was looking at something older, something that reached back before the wedding, before Harbor Pines, before Chelsea's marriage crisis. I had gone looking for the first time Dad might have used Grandma's money. Instead, I had found 2 times he might have used mine to put it back. The blue ledger was still sitting on Grandma's dining room table the next morning, exactly where we had left it. I noticed it before I noticed anything else. Not because it looked important, it didn't. The cloth cover had faded at the corners, and one edge had been repaired with clear tape years ago. If somebody had broken into the house looking for financial records, they probably would have walked past it without a second glance. Dad had certainly spent most of his life treating it that way. An outdated habit, a paper version of information the bank already had. Sitting across from it after finding those old transfers, I no longer thought the book was quaint. I thought it might be the only place in the family where nobody had been allowed to rewrite the past. Grandma poured coffee for both of us, then sat down and opened the ledger to the year of the first transfer I had found. Roof, she said. I gave her the date Dad had called me and the date I wired him $12,000. She moved through the pages slowly. Her handwriting had not changed much over the years. Every entry followed the same simple pattern. Date, amount, name, purpose. A gift to my cousin when she bought her first house. Money she loaned Dad when his car transmission failed. A payment to a contractor after a tree damaged the back fence. She had even written down $500 she gave Chelsea after the birth of her second child, with the note, "For whatever makes sleep easier." I smiled when I saw that. Grandma caught it. What? Nothing. You're smiling at my bookkeeping. You wrote, "Whatever makes sleep easier." She had a new baby. Fair. The smile disappeared when we reached the week Dad had borrowed $12,000 from me. There was an entry involving Dad. Not $12,000. A smaller amount from months earlier, clearly marked as a loan and later marked repaid. Nothing that explained the deposit we had seen on the bank statement 3 days after my money reached him. Grandma turned the page. Nothing. She went back and checked again. I don't have a note for it, she said. That doesn't mean there wasn't a reason. No. I appreciated that she did not force certainty any more than I did. We moved to the year of the $8,000 transfer. Again, the ledger recorded other transactions with Dad. Again, there was nothing matching the reimbursement we had found in the bank records. Then Grandma went to the most recent pages. The Harbor Pines entry was exactly where I remembered it. $40,000. Harbor Pines Reserve. Do not move. She ran one finger under the words. I wrote this the day I moved the money into that account. I nodded. She turned several pages forward, covering the period when Dad had transferred it out. No loan to Robert. No gift to Robert. No note saying the money could be used temporarily. Nothing. Grandma closed the book. For a while, neither of us said anything. I was the first to break the silence. This helps. With what? With showing what you intended. It shows what I wrote. That too. She looked at me. I knew exactly what she was waiting for, so I said it before she had to. It doesn't prove you never had a conversation with him later. No. And Dad could still claim you gave him permission verbally. Yes, but every significant loan and gift I can see is recorded. Yes, and this says not to move the money. Yes. Grandma folded her hands over the ledger. Then she said, I know what I meant. That was more important than anything I could have written in my notes. I had been treating the ledger like evidence, because evidence was something I knew how to work with. Grandma was looking at it as memory. Not memory in the fragile sense Dad had started implying whenever it suited him. Memory as continuity. A record of how she had handled money for years. Dad could argue about a conversation nobody else heard. He could not easily explain why every other large transaction followed one pattern, and this one suddenly did not. He's going to say you forgot, I said. Grandma's mouth tightened. I know. He may say you're confused because of the surgery. I know. Or that you gave him broad authority. I know, Morgan. I stopped. She looked tired again. Not physically. Her hip had healed well enough that she moved around the kitchen without the cane she had used during winter. This was something else. The exhaustion of realizing someone you trusted might respond to being questioned not by explaining himself, but by questioning your ability to remember. I'm sorry, I said. For what? That you have to prove you know what you wanted done with your own money. Grandma looked down at the ledger. He's my son. I know. He wasn't always like this. I waited. She ran her thumb over the worn edge of the cover. When your grandfather died, Robert handled more things than I asked him to. At the time, I was grateful. How long ago? Years. Did he take money then? Grandma looked up sharply. I didn't say he did. I know. I'm asking whether the pattern started with finances. No, it started with decisions. That caught me, she continued. He would call the insurance company before I decided whether I wanted to. He would schedule repairs because he thought they couldn't wait. He would tell me which contractor was best, which car I should buy, which doctor's office was easier to get to. Did you tell him to stop? Sometimes. What happened? He would say he was only helping. The phrase sounded familiar. Grandma gave a small, humorless smile. And most of the time, what he decided was reasonable. That made it harder to object. I understood that better than I wanted to. Bad control was easy to recognize when the decisions were obviously bad. Good decisions made control look like competence. Dad had built an entire identity around being useful. People thanked him. Then they stopped noticing when useful became entitled. Grandma opened the ledger again, but this time she did not look at the numbers. I let a lot of things go because it was easier. I said nothing. I told myself there was no point fighting over small things if Robert meant well. You weren't responsible for what he did with that. She gave me a look. You sound like you're trying to rescue me from feeling guilty. I might be. Stop. I almost smiled. Okay. Grandma leaned back. I'm not saying I caused it. I'm saying every time he crossed a line and I pretended I didn't see it because I wanted peace, I taught him something. What? That I would complain and then let him keep deciding. The honesty of that made me uncomfortable. Not because it was wrong. Because I could already see where it was pointing. Grandma looked at me. You do it too. I blinked. Excuse me? You decide things. I ask questions. You decide very efficiently. That sounds like a compliment. It isn't always. I felt myself get defensive before I could stop it. I'm not Dad. I didn't say you were. I'm not taking your money. No. I'm not hiding anything from you. No. Then what exactly are you comparing? Grandma did not answer right away. She reached for her coffee. You came in here yesterday ready to call the bank, the lawyer, Harbor Pines, everybody you could think of. Because something was wrong. Yes. And you needed help. Yes. I was helping. She raised her eyebrows. The word sounded different when she gave it back to me. I looked away. That is not the same. No, she said. It isn't. But that doesn't mean you should ignore the part that is. I did not like that. I liked it even less, because Ethan had already said almost the same thing. What part? You see a problem and decide the fastest route through it. That's literally my job. I know. And usually it works. I know. Grandma, Dad took $40,000 out of your account. Yes. So forgive me if I'm not approaching this like a philosophical exercise. Her voice hardened. Don't talk to me like I'm avoiding it. I stopped. She rarely raised her voice. She did not need to. I looked at her face and realized I had done exactly what I was accusing Dad of doing. Deciding that because my urgency was justified, my way of handling it should automatically become hers. He sat back. Grandma said, "You want me to act faster?" Yes. You want me to cut him off immediately? Yes. You want me to protect whatever is left? Yes. You may be right about every one of those things. I waited. That still doesn't make them your decisions. There it was. The sentence Ethan had pushed me toward. The sentence I had written on my legal pad. Grandma still gets to decide. I looked down at my hands. You're right. Grandma's expression softened slightly, but she did not let me escape with the easiest version. That fast? Do you want me to argue longer? A little. You usually do. I laughed once. Then I became serious again. I'm sorry. For what? For turning into a project manager. You are a project manager. Operations manager. Same disease. That made me laugh again. The relief lasted only a few seconds, but I needed it. Then I asked, "What do you want to do?" Grandma looked at the ledger. Not at me. Not at the bank records. The ledger. I want Robert removed from my accounts. The answer was calm enough that I almost missed how final it was. Okay. I want to speak with an attorney before I sign anything. Okay. I want somebody independent helping me until I decide what I'm comfortable handling myself. Okay. And I want a full accounting. I reached for my notebook, then stopped myself. Grandma noticed. You can write that one down. I did. What period? She thought for a moment. The last few years. That surprised me. Not just the 40,000? No. Because of the old deposits? Because I want to know. That was reason enough. We contacted the attorney Grandma had been referred to through her financial advisor. I did not call first. Grandma did. I sat with her while she explained the situation in her own words. The attorney asked practical questions about the power of attorney document, the accounts Dad could access when the questionable transfer occurred, and what records Grandma had already received. He did not promise a dramatic outcome. He did not tell her that Dad was definitely guilty of a crime. He said the immediate priorities were making sure Grandma understood her options, securing future control according to her wishes, and requesting the records necessary to determine what had happened. That was exactly the kind of boring answer I wanted. Boring meant process. Process meant nobody had to rely on whoever could tell the most convincing story. Grandma arranged to provide the documents. She asked about ending Dad's authority. The attorney explained the steps and the need to notify the relevant institutions properly so they knew his authority had been revoked. Grandma asked whether she should appoint me instead. I felt something tighten in my chest. Before I could say anything, she answered her own question. No. The attorney paused. Grandma looked at me. I don't want to replace one family arrangement with another. I nodded. That makes sense. It did. Even though a small, irrational part of me wanted to say that I would never do what Dad had done. That was not the point. Trusting me did not require giving me control. Grandma chose to use independent professional assistance while keeping decisions in her own hands. When the call ended, she looked relieved for the first time in days. You okay? I asked. I will be. What do you need from me? A ride next week. That I can do. And help me organize the statements. Definitely. No calling Robert before I do. I held up both hands. Understood. She narrowed her eyes. That was too easy. I'm growing. Slowly. 2 days later, Grandma told Dad his authority was being revoked. She did it herself. I was there because she asked me to be, but I did not speak first. Dad answered, and Grandma told him directly that she had spoken with an attorney and would no longer allow him to manage her accounts. He went silent. Then he asked, "Why?" Grandma looked at me once, almost in disbelief. "Because $40,000 is missing." "It is not missing. It is not where I put it. I told you I'm replacing it." "Then replace it." "I'm working on it." "While you work on it, you will not move anything else." Dad's voice tightened. "Morgan put you up to this." Grandma's face changed. "Not much. Just enough." "No. She has been angry since the wedding." "This is not about her wedding. She's been feeding you questions." "I had questions before she arrived." "You never questioned me like this before." Grandma took a breath. "That may have been my mistake." Dad went quiet. I almost looked away. That sentence landed harder than any accusation. Dad recovered quickly. "You don't understand how complicated this is," Grandma said. "Then the accounting will help me understand." "What accounting?" "I want records for the last several years." His silence lasted too long. I felt every instinct in me sharpen. Grandma did not. She stayed still. Finally, Dad said, "That's ridiculous." "Why?" "Because you're acting like I've been stealing from you." "I did not use that word." "You didn't have to." "Then show me the records." "You trust some lawyer more than your own son?" "I trusted my son with my money." Dad did not answer that. Instead, he came back to me. "Morgan, are you there?" I looked at Grandma. She nodded. "Yes." "You happy now?" "No." "This is what you wanted?" "No." "You've been looking for a way to punish us." I could feel myself getting angry. Not the hot kind. The colder kind. The kind that made my words cleaner. "You moved Grandma's money." "I managed it." "She asked you not to manage anything else." "She doesn't understand what you're doing." Grandma's voice cut in. "I'm sitting right here." Dad ignored her. "Morgan, you are turning this into something it isn't." I looked at Grandma again. This time, she did not need to nod. I knew the answer. She made the decision. Dad laughed once. It was not amusement. "You expect me to believe Mom suddenly decided to hire strangers and remove me from her finances without you pushing her?" "Yes." "Because you're so uninvolved?" "I'm helping her organize what she asks me to organize." "That's not what this is." "No," Grandma said. "This is me telling you that you no longer have authority over my accounts." Dad finally stopped talking. For 1 second, I thought he might apologize. He didn't. He said, "You'll regret this." Grandma ended the call. I waited until she put the phone down. "You okay?" She nodded, but her eyes looked wet. I did not hug her immediately. I had learned something, so I asked, "Do you want a hug?" That made her laugh through the tears. "Yes, Morgan." Then I hugged her. The revocation process took paperwork and proper notifications. It did not magically make every problem disappear that afternoon. Dad still had to provide records. The bank still needed documentation. The attorney still needed to review the scope of the authority Dad had held. Grandma's advisor helped identify which accounts required attention. Nothing happened in one cinematic sweep. That was fine. We had stopped relying on speed. What mattered was that the direction had changed. Dad no longer got to decide because he was Dad. Grandma decided. About a week later, the first batch of older records arrived for review. I was at Grandma's house when she opened the folder. We had both learned not to expect one neat answer. The statements covered years. Hundreds of transactions. Most were ordinary. Utilities. Insurance. Transfers between Grandma's own accounts. Deposits. Checks. The normal financial life of an older woman who had saved carefully and rarely spent recklessly. We were not looking for a magic number. We were looking for patterns. Grandma took the year of the $12,000 loan I had made Dad. I took the year after. We worked quietly for nearly an hour. Then Grandma stopped. "What date did you send Robert the $12,000? I gave it to her." She ran one finger down the statement. I already knew there had been a deposit from Dad a few days later. We had seen it before. But this time, the older transaction details gave us more context. The reimbursement was not a random check. It was tied to a prior movement out of Grandma's funds that Dad had handled. Not enough, on its own, to explain everything. Not enough for me to say what every dollar had done, but enough to make the sequence uglier. Money moved out under Dad's control. Dad asked me for help. My money reached him. Money moved back toward Grandma. I looked at the dates again. Grandma did too. Neither of us spoke. Then she said very quietly, "Find the 8,000. I turned to the next folder. For the first time, I was no longer wondering whether the $40,000 was an isolated mistake. I was wondering how long my father had been solving one person's problem with another person's money. The $8,000 transfer was worse because by then I knew what to look for. My money had reached Dad on a Thursday. 4 days earlier, money had moved out of one of Grandma's accounts under the authority Dad was using for her. 5 days after my transfer, Dad sent money back toward that same account. The amounts did not match perfectly. The dates were not mirror images. If they had been, I might have distrusted the pattern simply because it was too neat. Real life rarely organized itself that politely. But the sequence was there, and when I laid the two incidents beside the $40,000 he had asked me for after the wedding, I could no longer pretend I was looking at 3 unrelated family emergencies. Ethan helped me build the timeline that night because I had reached the point where I was staring at numbers so long they stopped meaning anything. We sat at the dining room table with old bank statements, copies Grandma had authorized me to keep for organization, and the notes I had been writing since Dad's first call. I drew 3 horizontal lines across a sheet of paper. The first was the roof. Money moved out of Grandma's account under Dad's handling. A few days later, Dad called me and said he had a contractor problem and needed $12,000. I transferred it. Soon after, money moved back toward Grandma. The second was the tax issue. Again, money had moved out. Dad called me about $8,000. I sent it. Money later moved back. The third was the current $40,000. Money moved out of Grandma's Harbor Pines reserve. Dad called me the morning she was about to look at the account and asked for exactly $40,000. Ethan read the page without speaking. I said, "Tell me I'm forcing a pattern." "I don't think you're forcing one." "That isn't the same as saying it proves anything." "No." I appreciated the answer even though part of me wanted him to say, "Yes, Morgan, this proves everything. Call everyone." I pointed at the older dates. "The amounts aren't exact." "I see that. There could be explanations." "There could? He may have owed her money for something else." "He may have." "You're being very helpful. You asked me not to let you outrun the evidence." "I regret that." He looked at the latest line. "What do you think happened?" I hesitated. That was different from asking what I could prove. "I think Dad moved money when he decided somebody in the family needed it more. Then, if Grandma might notice, he found another source to replace some or all of it. And you were a source. At least twice. Maybe. Maybe." I hated that word. I also trusted it. There were only 2 older examples we had found. 2 did not prove a decade-long system. The accounting was still incomplete. But I could not get past the fact that Dad's instinct after moving Grandma's $40,000 had been to call me. He did not sound like a man inventing a solution under pressure. He sounded like a man executing a familiar one. I called him the next afternoon. I did not tell Grandma first because I was not calling on her behalf. I was asking about money I had personally given him. Dad answered with, "What now?" "Nah, hello," I said. "I pulled the records from the roof loan." He was silent. "And the tax money, what about them?" "I want to know what they were actually for." "They were for exactly what I told you." "Then this should be easy." His tone sharpened. "Morgan, I'm done with these interrogations." "I'm not. You got Mom to remove me from her accounts. You got your lawyer involved. Grandma hired her own attorney. Don't play word games." "I'm not. You've made your point." "What point?" "That you're angry." I almost laughed. That is the least disputed fact in this entire situation. Dad went quiet for a second. I continued. 3 years ago, money moved out of Grandma's account. Then you called me for $12,000. Shortly after I sent it, you put money back into Grandma's account. A similar thing happened around the $8,000 you asked me for later. You have no idea what you're looking at. That's why I called. My finances are none of your business. The money I gave you is... I paid you back. Eventually. So what exactly are you complaining about? I'm asking whether the roof loan and tax loan were actually used to replace money you had moved out of Grandma's accounts. His response came too fast. That's ridiculous. Then explain the dates. I don't remember transactions from years ago. You remembered enough to tell Grandma you had authority to move $40,000 last month. That is completely different. How? Because I was managing her finances. Were you managing them 3 years ago too? Dad stopped. I felt my pulse shift. Not because silence was proof, because it meant I had finally asked a question he had not prepared for. I said, "How long have I been replacing money you took from Grandma?" His voice went cold. "You need to be very careful what you accuse me of." I asked a question. "You're calling me a thief." I did not use that word. You didn't have to. That was almost exactly what he had said to Grandma. I realized then that Dad heard every request for explanation as an accusation, because explanation meant somebody else believed they had the right to evaluate his decisions. "Then give me another explanation," I said. "I do not owe you an accounting of every time I helped my mother. You asked me for money, and I repaid you. That doesn't answer where it went. This is what you do. You decide you're right, then you build some case around it." I looked at the timeline in front of me. Maybe there was truth in the first half of that sentence. I did like structure. I did become relentless once something failed my internal logic test. But this time, the records had come first. "Dad, I didn't create these dates. You're making them mean something because you're furious about the wedding." There it was. Again, the safest place for him to hide. "You really need this to be about my wedding." "It is about your wedding." "No. My wedding explains why I'm angry with you. It does not explain why Grandma's money went into your account. You're poisoning her against us. Grandma asked for her own records. Because you got in her ear. She's 82, not 8. I know how old my mother is. Then stop talking about her as if she can be programmed." He hung up. I did not call back. 10 minutes later, my phone rang again. For one irrational second, I thought Dad had reconsidered. It was Aunt Denise. Dad's older cousin had been at my wedding. She had hugged me before leaving and told me she was sorry Robert and Linda were not there. I had not spoken to her since. "Morgan, honey," she said. "Can we talk?" That opening never meant anything good. "Sure. I don't want to get in the middle." Anyone who said that had already entered the middle. "Okay. Your mother called me." Of course she had. I looked at the clock. Dad had hung up 10 minutes earlier. Mom worked fast. Denise continued. "She says things have gotten really ugly with your grandmother." "What did she say?" "That you're trying to take over Ruth's finances." I felt something cold move through me. "What else?" "That you convinced her Robert can't be trusted." "What else?" Denise hesitated. "Morgan, I need to know what she told you. She said you've been furious since they missed the wedding and now you're dragging Ruth into it." I stood and walked toward the window. "That's not what happened. I figured there were two sides." "There are. I just don't want you doing something you regret because you're hurt." That sentence almost made me lose my temper. Not because Denise meant harm, because Mom had selected the perfect story. Morgan is hurt. Morgan is angry. Morgan is controlling. Every one of those things contained enough truth to make the lie around them sound reasonable. "Yes," I said, "I'm hurt." Denise went quiet. "I was hurt when they skipped my wedding. I'm still hurt. I understand. But Grandma found $40,000 missing from an account she had set aside for her move." Silence. I stopped there. I did not send bank statements. I did not tell her about Dad's advisor email. I did not start narrating Chelsea's debt. "That's something Ruth and her attorney are handling," I said. Denise sounded confused. "Your mother made it sound like you were handling everything." "I'm not." "Then why is Robert saying you got him removed?" "Because Grandma decided to remove him." A longer silence. Finally, Denise said, "I think everybody needs to calm down." "I'm sure they do." That was the first call. There were 4 more over the next 2 days. One cousin texted asking whether Grandma was okay mentally. An uncle I rarely heard from wrote that financial disagreements destroyed families, and I should remember that my parents had always done their best. Someone else asked if it was true I was trying to become Grandma's new power of attorney. That one angered me enough that I typed a reply with screenshots attached. I wrote the entire thing. Grandma's reserve, the transfer, Dad's account, Harbor Pines, the email, the old pattern. I attached a copy of the statement with private information covered. I attached the advisor email Grandma had shared with me. I wrote that Ruth had chosen an independent professional instead of giving me any authority precisely because none of us wanted this turned into one family member replacing another. Then I started a second paragraph. I wrote about the wedding. I wrote that Mom had called it a waste of time, then spent thousands of dollars in Hawaii. I wrote that Dad had remembered it was my wedding weekend and gone anyway. I wrote that Mom had said I would be fine. By the time I finished, it was no longer a factual correction. It was a prosecution. I reread it and imagined pressing send. Part of me wanted every person in the family to feel stupid for calling me. I wanted Mom's phone to start ringing. I wanted Dad to have to explain himself. I wanted someone else to say, for once, Morgan was right. My thumb hovered over the button. Then Ethan walked into the room. He looked at my face, then at my phone. "What are you doing?" "Correcting misinformation." "That sounds dangerous. Read it." He did. The first page did not concern him much. The second did. "You really want to send this?" "Yes." He handed me the phone. "That wasn't a judgment." "I know. You want my opinion?" "No." He waited. "Fine. Yes." He sat across from me. "What do you want to happen after you send it?" "I want them to know Mom is lying." "They may." "I want them to stop calling me." "They might." "I want Mom to stop telling everyone I'm manipulating Grandma." "Probably won't." I hated that. "So what am I supposed to do? Say nothing while she controls the story?" "I didn't say that." "It sounds like it." "No, I'm asking what your goal is." "My goal is the truth." "That's not a goal, that's a value." I gave him a look. He continued. "Do you need everybody in your family to understand you right now? Or do you need Ruth protected while her records are being reviewed?" "Both." "I know. I'm allowed to want both. Absolutely. But you only control one." I looked at the message again. "This isn't fair." "No. She gets to tell people I'm using Grandma because I'm mad about the wedding, and if I defend myself, I look exactly as dramatic as she says I am." "Yes. That's a terrible system." "Yes. You're agreeing too much. It seems safer." I almost smiled. Then he became serious. "If you send everything you have to people who aren't involved, what happens next?" "They know. They forward it." I stopped. "Somebody calls your dad." I knew where he was going. He knows exactly what Ruth has. Exactly. He starts preparing explanations around evidence he hasn't seen yet. Maybe. I looked at the attachments again. My anger had nearly turned our information advantage into a family newsletter. I deleted the draft. Not because Mom deserved my silence. Not because I was afraid of confrontation. Because timing mattered more than satisfaction. I responded to the cousin with one sentence. "Grandma is making her own financial decisions with independent professional advice, and I do not have authority over her accounts." That was all. I used variations of the same sentence every time someone contacted me. Some believed me. Some probably didn't. I stopped trying to control that. Dad and Mom had spent years building a family structure where they were the default narrators. Dad explained the money. Mom explained the emotions. Chelsea explained the crisis. I was usually the one who cleaned up whatever remained after everyone finished talking. For the first time, I let people think something about me that I knew was wrong. I did not enjoy it. That was important too. Restraint did not feel noble. It felt awful. A few nights later, I was going through my phone looking for an old message from Dad about the tax loan when I noticed a voicemail I had never deleted. The date was May 8th. The morning he asked me for $40,000. I remembered seeing it later that day. Dad had called once more after our first conversation and left a message when I did not answer. At the time, Grandma had already called me about the bank statement, and everything had started moving so quickly that I listened only once. I pressed play. Dad's voice filled the kitchen. "Morgan, call me back. I don't know why you're making this harder than it needs to be. I need this handled today. I need this replaced before your grandmother starts asking questions. We can sort everything else out later." Just call me." The message ended. I stared at my phone. Ethan looked up from the other end of the table. "What?" I played it again. This time I heard every word. "I need this replaced before your grandmother starts asking questions." Replaced. Not paid. Not borrowed. Not invested. Replaced. I had heard the word before. Dad had used it in conversations with Grandma too, but each time there had been so much noise around it, urgency, wedding, anger, Harbor Pines, Mom in the background, that I had treated it as ordinary language. Now I had the old timeline sitting beside me. Money leaves Grandma. Dad asks me. Money goes back. Replace. I pressed pause after the word. Ethan did not speak. I said, he knew. Be specific. I hated that he had learned my system. He knew there was something missing that needed to be replaced. That's fair. He knew Grandma asking questions was the problem. Yes. He wasn't asking me to fund some separate emergency. Looks that way. I stood and paced once across the room. That still doesn't prove what happened 3 years ago. No. It doesn't prove every old transfer. No. It doesn't prove Mom knew the details. No. But it tells me what he thought he was doing on May 8th. Yes. I picked up the phone again. For the first time since this began, the $40,000 itself no longer felt like the central mystery. I knew why Dad needed it. He needed the hole filled before Grandma saw it. The question that remained was worse. Had he called me because I was simply the most convenient person available that morning? Or had I always been part of the plan? I went back through the early timeline. Dad had looked at Grandma's reserve before Hawaii. He had moved the money. He had paid for the trip and some of Chelsea's obligations. Mom had said Grandma would not need it yet. Then Harbor Pines called earlier than expected. And Dad immediately called me. $40,000. Today? Not, can you help? Not, how much do you have? Not, I made a mistake. He named the exact amount. He assumed availability. He assumed compliance. He assumed I would ask fewer questions than the bank. I thought about the old roof loan, the tax issue. Dad had sounded embarrassed both times, but never uncertain that I would help. I had always interpreted that as trust. Maybe it had been something else. Maybe every time my parents praised me for being responsible, they were also calculating what responsibility made available to them. I sat back down. Ethan asked, "What are you thinking?" I'm thinking there had to be a moment. A moment when what? When Dad decided I would replace the $40,000. He called you. No, before that. I pointed to the timeline. If this was a real plan, not just panic, there had to be some point before Harbor Pines called when he or Mom thought about what would happen if Grandma needed the money sooner than expected. Ethan looked at the paper. Maybe. If they never considered it, then I was just the emergency solution. And if they did, then they spent Grandma's money believing mine was already available. I heard how angry I sounded. This time I did not correct it. There was nothing wrong with being angry at something worth being angry about. I just could not let anger invent the missing piece. So I wrote one final line beneath the timeline. When did they decide Morgan would cover it? I did not know the answer. But for the first time, I was certain there was a question more important than where Dad had spent the $40,000. I wanted to know when my family had started treating my consent as something they no longer needed to ask for. By the following week, I had become the villain in a story I had not written. I knew because people kept calling to explain my own motives to me. Mom's version had spread efficiently through the family. I was still furious about the wedding. I had gotten into Grandma's head. I wanted Dad removed from the finances so I could take over, and I was using one questionable transfer as an excuse to punish everyone who had chosen Chelsea over me. The details changed depending on who repeated them, but the structure was always the same. Dad had made a temporary financial decision. Grandma had been fine until I became involved. Now lawyers were asking questions. The family was divided. And somehow the person who had never possessed Grandma's money had become the person everyone was warned might take it. At first I answered every call. Not with documents, not with the entire timeline, but with the same plain facts. Grandma had chosen her own attorney. Grandma had chosen independent financial help. I had no authority over her accounts. I could not sign for her, move her money, or make financial decisions on her behalf. Some relatives accepted that. Others heard it as a carefully rehearsed denial, which was almost funny considering how hard Mom had worked to make me sound calculating. One cousin asked, "So you're saying you don't have access to anything?" "No." "None of Ruth's accounts?" "None." "You're not her power of attorney?" "No." "Then what exactly are you getting out of this?" I remember staring at the phone after that question. Nothing. That was what made Mom's story so strange. I was not getting money. I was not getting authority. Grandma had not offered me her house, changed a will, promised me some future reward, or handed me control of an investment. I had spent weeks helping an 82-year-old woman sort statements and drive to appointments because she asked me to. The outcome that supposedly proved my greed had actually removed me from the financial structure entirely. "I'm getting my grandmother's questions answered," I told my cousin. She went quiet. That should have been enough. It wasn't. Mom had one advantage I did not. She understood the family's emotional habits better than anyone. Facts were slow. Fear was immediate. Tell people Morgan has no access to Grandma's money, and they have to think about it. Tell them an angry daughter is manipulating an old woman because her parents missed her wedding, and they instantly know what kind of story they are hearing. The irritating part was that Mom was not entirely inventing the angry daughter. I was angry. I just wasn't stealing anything. Grandma noticed the calls before I told her about them. Aunt Denise contacted her directly and asked whether she was comfortable with all the changes. Grandma answered yes. Then an uncle asked if she was sure she wanted an outsider helping with her accounts. Grandma said yes again. By the third call, she stopped being polite. "I am 82, she told one relative while I was sitting in her kitchen. "I am not a hostage." I covered my mouth so she would not see me smile. After she hung up, she looked at me. "Your mother has been busy. That appears to be her new hobby. My finances were boring for 40 years. Suddenly everyone is fascinated. Families love privacy until there's something they can gossip about." Grandma shook her head. "No. They love privacy when it protects the person they already agree with." That was better than anything I had been thinking. She went back to the papers in front of her. The practical result of Dad losing access was much less dramatic than Mom made it sound. Grandma still paid her own bills. Her advisor and attorney helped make sure the institutions had the proper revocation notices. A professional service was available when she needed administrative help. I organized documents only when she asked. If anything, I had less control than Dad had ever held. Mom never mentioned that part when she called relatives. Neither did Dad. Chelsea did. Not immediately. The first time she called me that week, she sounded angry enough that I almost let it go to voicemail. "You're destroying them," she said. "Nah, hello." Apparently direct openings ran in the family. "Who?" "Mom and Dad." "What did I do today?" "Don't." That's a real question. Dad can barely talk to Grandma. Mom has half the family calling her asking what's happening. Everyone thinks there's going to be some lawsuit. That last part did not come from me. "You know what this is doing to them." I was tired of that sentence. Not because it was false, because it treated consequences as if they were something I had manufactured. I'm not asking Grandma to give me anything. That's not the point. I don't have access to her accounts. I know. I'm not replacing Dad. I know. I'm not telling her what to do. Chelsea hesitated. Then what exactly am I doing to them? You keep pushing. For what? For answers. Yes. You could stop. That was the moment I realized how deeply Chelsea still believed in the family system. She did not tell me Dad was innocent. She did not tell me the $40,000 had never moved. She did not tell me Grandma had authorized it. She told me I could stop asking. The solution was not for Dad to explain himself. The solution was for the questions to end. I said, "Grandma wants the accounting." "Because you convinced her she needed one." "No. Because $40,000 left an account she had labeled not to move. You know Dad was going to put it back." "With what?" Chelsea went quiet. "That's the question nobody seems interested in answering. Dad has money. Then why did he call me?" "I don't know." "Exactly." Chelsea exhaled. "You've already made your point. That's something Dad keeps saying too." "Because you have." "No. A point is something you make in an argument. Grandma's money is still a fact. She was silent. Then she said, Ryan and I are staying apart right now. The shift was so abrupt that I almost missed it. I'm sorry. He's at his brother's. Are the kids okay? Yes. We're not fighting in front of them. That's good. He says he needs to see every account before he decides what happens next. That sounds reasonable. You don't have to sound pleased. I don't. You always hated that Mom and Dad helped me. There were several ways I could have answered. Instead, I said, I hated that helping you always seemed to require pretending someone else wasn't being hurt. Chelsea did not respond. I softened my voice slightly. Your marriage is not my revenge. It feels like everything started because of you. No, everything became visible because Grandma looked at her account. Another silence. Then Chelsea said something I did not expect. Mom keeps telling me not to give Ryan every detail yet. Of course she did. What does she want you to do? She says he's emotional. That if I dump every number on him while he's angry, he'll make a decision he regrets. What do you think? I think I'm tired of hiding numbers. That was the first thing Chelsea had said in weeks that sounded like movement instead of defense. Then don't. Easy for you. No. Simple and easy are different. She gave a short laugh. God, you sound like Grandma. I'll take that. We ended the call without resolving anything. That was becoming normal. For most of our lives, conversations between Chelsea and me had ended with somebody winning, somebody apologizing, or somebody hanging up. Now we were having conversations that simply stopped because neither of us had a clean answer. A few days later, Ryan called while I was driving home from work. I pulled into a grocery store parking lot before answering because by then I had learned that family calls had a way of becoming evidence. I just wanted you to know Chelsea and I are staying apart for a while, he said. She told me, I'm not filing anything right now. You don't need to explain that to me. I know. I just don't want the family turning it into something it isn't. I almost told him he had picked the wrong family for that goal. Instead, I asked, Are you okay? No. That was honest, he continued. I'm not trying to punish her. I need the numbers. I can't make decisions about a marriage if I don't know what's real. I understand. And if your dad paid bills I didn't know about, I want those included. He should be able to account for what he paid. That's what I told Chelsea. Good. Ryan hesitated. Your mother called me again. What did she want? She said I was tearing apart the family over money. There it was. What did you say? That the money was not the only problem. I waited. She didn't like that. I'm shocked. He laughed despite himself. Then he said, She keeps trying to make this about you. I know. I thought you should know she's doing the same thing with Chelsea. That got my attention. What does that mean? She told Chelsea you're manipulating Ruth because you want control. Chelsea told me that. She also told Chelsea your dad had permission for everything and you're twisting normal family help into something ugly. Did Chelsea believe her? I don't know anymore. Neither did I. The answer came 2 nights later. Chelsea called after 10. Her voice was low. Are you alone? Ethan's upstairs. Can you check your texts? My stomach tightened. Why? Just look. A message came through while she was still on the line. It was a screenshot. At first, I did not understand what I was looking at because the conversation was between Mom and Dad, not a family group. Dad's name appeared at the top of the screenshot. The timestamp was from Hawaii. What is this? I asked. Mom sent it to me. When? About 10 minutes ago. Why? Chelsea took a breath. Because I asked her whether Dad really thought Grandma had given him permission. I sat down. What did she say? She said yes. She said everybody is twisting what happened. She said Dad wasn't stealing anything. He was moving money temporarily because I was in trouble and he knew Grandma wouldn't need it right away. That's already different from what Dad said. I know. What did you ask? I asked her to show me. That surprised me. Show you what? Anything. A message. Something where Dad acted like he thought this was legitimate. And she sent this? Yes. I enlarged the screenshot. The section Mom had apparently intended Chelsea to focus on was Dad writing that he was worried timing might become an issue if Grandma's plans changed sooner than expected. Mom had highlighted another sentence about keeping things together until Chelsea and Ryan get through this. I understood immediately why she had sent it. In Mom's mind, the exchange proved motive. They were helping Chelsea. They planned to restore the money. They did not see themselves as thieves. Mom believed context would excuse them. Then I read 2 lines lower. Mom had written, "If Ruth needs it sooner, Morgan can cover it. She always has money set aside." I stopped breathing for a second. "What?" Chelsea asked. "You saw it." "Yes." I read it again. Not because I had misunderstood it, because I hadn't. If Ruth needs it sooner, that meant Mom knew there was a possibility Grandma could need the money before Dad restored it. Morgan can cover it. Not ask Morgan. Not see whether Morgan can help. Not borrow from Morgan if she agrees. Morgan can cover it. She always has money set aside. The assumption was so complete that my consent had disappeared from the sentence. I checked the timestamp. They were in Hawaii, before Harbor Pines called. Before Dad's desperate phone call. Before anyone knew a unit would open early. My heart started pounding. "Did you ever see this conversation before tonight?" I asked. "No." "You're sure?" "Yes." "You never had access to Mom's phone in Hawaii?" "No." "She never showed you this?" "No." I heard her say Grandma wouldn't need it yet. But I never saw this. That mattered. It preserved the difference between what Chelsea had suspected then and what she knew now. "Why do you think Mom sent the screenshot?" Chelsea laughed once, but there was no humor in it. "Because she thought it helped her." Of course she did. Mom had spent so long deciding what every event meant that she had started believing the facts themselves belonged to her interpretation. In her version, the text did not say Morgan had been used. It said the family had a backup plan. I asked, "What did you say after she sent it?" "Nothing." "Nothing?" I read it and told her I had to go. "And then you sent it to me." "Yes." I looked at the message again. This was before Dad called me. I know. Before Harbor Pines contacted him. I checked. So they had already talked about what would happen if Grandma needed the money. Yes. And the answer was me. Chelsea said nothing. I felt anger rise through me, but it was different from the anger after the wedding. That had been rejection. This was erasure. My parents had spent money that did not belong to them while treating my future agreement as a resource they already possessed. I said, "They budgeted me into it." Chelsea's voice cracked slightly. "I'm sorry." I was not ready to accept an apology. Not because she had sent the text. Because part of the reason they had spent the money was her. "You didn't write this." "No, but you were why they were doing it." "I know, and you heard enough in Hawaii to know something was wrong." "I know." It was the first time she did not resist any part of the sentence. I asked, "Does Ryan know?" "Not yet." "You need to tell him." "I know. I'm not doing it for you." "I didn't ask you to." That mattered too. Chelsea sounded exhausted. "Mom kept saying Dad had a plan," she said. "I thought the plan meant he had money somewhere." "So did I." "No, you asked." I went quiet. She continued, "I didn't." There was nothing useful to add. After we ended the call, I sat alone at the kitchen table and stared at the screenshot until Ethan came downstairs. He took one look at me. "What happened?" I handed him the phone. He read it. Then he read it again. "That's the moment," I said. "What moment?" "The one I was looking for." He looked at the text. They had already decided what happened if Ruth needed the money. "Yes." "And that was you." "Yes." He handed the phone back. I expected him to tell me not to send it to the family. I expected some version of stay focused, protect Grandma, don't let anger choose the next move. He did not. He just sat beside me. I think he understood I had finally reached a piece of the story I needed to feel before I could organize it. My entire life, my parents had described my independence as admiration. Morgan is responsible. Morgan plans ahead. Morgan has savings. Morgan will be fine. I had believed those words meant they respected me. Now I was looking at what those compliments became when nobody bothered asking whether I agreed. A reserve account. A backup source. Insurance. Dad had not called me because he ran out of options on May 8th. Mom had not suddenly remembered I was good with money when Harbor Pines created a problem. They had already counted me. The call had only been the moment they came to collect. I saved the screenshot with the rest of Grandma's documents and sent a copy to her because it concerned her money. I did not send it to Aunt Denise. I did not post it anywhere. I did not call Mom. For the first time since all of this started, I did not feel an urgent need to confront anyone immediately. The message was enough. Mom and Dad had believed they were protecting family. They had spent Grandma's money to protect Chelsea's marriage, then protected themselves with the assumption that if anything went wrong, I would quietly restore the balance. No one had asked Grandma whether her money was available. No one had asked me whether mine was. That was the part I had been missing. They had not called me because they ran out of options. They called me because, in their minds, I had never been allowed to be an option. I was the guarantee. Grandma called the meeting for Saturday afternoon. She chose her own living room, which mattered more than anyone said out loud. For years, family decisions had happened wherever Dad was most comfortable. His kitchen, his office, the back table at whatever restaurant he picked. This time we sat in Grandma's house, around Grandma's coffee table, because the money was hers and the questions were hers. Ethan sat beside me. Chelsea and Ryan came separately. Mom arrived with Dad 5 minutes late, and the first thing she did was look at me as if I had arranged the entire room for maximum humiliation. Grandma had asked her attorney and financial advisor to come at the beginning. Neither stayed for the whole meeting. They were there to confirm records, dates, and what Grandma had asked them to review. That was important. This was not a trial. Nobody was taking sworn testimony. Nobody was waiting for a judge to appear from the hallway. Grandma simply wanted to remove as many opportunities as possible for Dad to turn facts into family opinion. Dad sat down and said, "I still don't understand why we need an audience for this." Grandma answered before anyone else could. "Because every time I ask you privately, the answer changes." His face tightened. Mom crossed her arms. "That's not fair." Grandma looked at her. "Linda, I did not ask you." That silenced the room. It was a small thing, but I felt it. Mom was used to feeling quiet before anyone else decided what it meant. Grandma had taken that space away from her in one sentence. Her advisor started with the timeline. He spoke carefully, using dates rather than conclusions. The Harbor Pines Reserve had existed before the wedding. $40,000 had been set aside. Dad had asked about moving the reserve before Hawaii. The advisor had told him the funds should remain liquid and preserved for Grandma's stated purpose. The money later moved through Dad's authorized access into an account he controlled. Within the same period, Dad made several large payments that aligned with the Hawaii trip and with obligations connected to Chelsea. Dad interrupted. "Aligned is doing a lot of work there." The advisor nodded. "That's why I said aligned." Dad looked irritated that the man had not taken the bait. "No one is saying every dollar can be labeled after it entered another account," the advisor continued. "We are saying the transaction sequence is documented." Mom said, "Robert had money of his own in that account." "Yes," the advisor said. "That is also documented." Mom looked at me as if this proved something. It didn't. It proved exactly what I had been saying from the beginning. The villa confirmation alone did not prove Grandma's exact dollars paid for Hawaii. The problem was larger and simpler. Dad had moved Grandma's $40,000 without her stated authorization, then spent significant money during the same period and could not restore her reserve when she needed it. Grandma asked, "Robert, did you move my $40,000? Dad looked at the advisor, then the attorney, then Grandma. "I transferred it." "Into your account?" "Yes." "Did I tell you to? You told me to manage things while you were recovering." "That isn't what I asked." Dad leaned forward. "Mom, we have gone over this. I had authority. You trusted me to make practical decisions." Grandma's voice stayed calm. "Did I tell you to use that money?" Dad exhaled sharply. "Not in those exact words." Chelsea looked down. Ryan did not move. I had heard the phrase before, but hearing it in a room full of people stripped away whatever protection it once gave him. Grandma opened the blue ledger. Dad actually laughed when he saw it. "You cannot be serious." "I am. That book is not a legal document." "I did not say it was." Dad turned toward the attorney. "Are we really doing this?" The attorney answered evenly. "Ruth asked me to be here while she reviews her own records. I'm here for her." Dad leaned back. Grandma flipped to several older pages. This is the loan I gave you when your transmission failed. Dad said nothing. This is money I gave Chelsea after the baby was born. Chelsea looked up. This is a gift to your cousin for her home. Grandma turned another page. This is Harbor Pines. She read the words aloud. $40,000, Harbor Pines Reserve, do not move. Mom made a frustrated sound. Ruth, you write down grocery money in that thing. No, Linda. I don't. Mom looked caught off guard. Grandma continued. I write down large gifts, large loans, large transfers. Robert says I told him he could use $40,000. There is no record, Dad said, because we talked. Then tell me when. I don't remember the date. Where? Mom. Were we here? On the phone? At your house? I don't remember every conversation we have. Grandma nodded. Neither do I. That is why I write important things down. Dad's face reddened. You're treating me like some criminal because I tried to help this family. There it was. Not because he thought he had permission. Because he believed his reason should replace permission. Grandma closed the ledger. Then tell us what you were helping. Dad looked at Chelsea. She stiffened. Mom spoke first. Her marriage was falling apart. Ryan's jaw tightened. Chelsea said, Mom. What? It was. That doesn't mean you get to tell it like that. Mom turned toward her. I was trying to protect you, Ryan said, by helping her hide debt from me. Mom looked at him as though he had committed the greater offense by saying it out loud. That is not what happened. Chelsea surprised me. Yes, it is. Everyone looked at her. Chelsea's hands were clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone pale. Dad paid things Ryan didn't know about, she said. I let him. Mom knew I was hiding accounts. Maybe she didn't know all of them, but she knew enough. Mom's voice sharpened. Chelsea. We were trying to give you time. I know. You told me you were scared Ryan would leave. I was. So we helped. Chelsea looked at her. That doesn't make what we did honest. The room went quiet. I had never heard my sister say anything like that to Mom. Dad leaned forward. Can we stop turning this into some morality play? Chelsea had a problem. Your grandmother had money she was not going to need immediately. I moved funds temporarily. I intended to restore them. Grandma asked, before or after Harbor Pines called. Dad looked at her. I was going to restore it. That wasn't my question. He did not answer. The advisor excused himself after confirming the remaining record questions Grandma had asked him to review. The attorney stayed a little longer, mainly because Grandma wanted him present when she made it clear Dad's financial authority had already been revoked and would not be restored. Once that was said, he left too. The room felt different after the professionals were gone. Less formal. More dangerous. There was nowhere left to hide inside technical language. Dad said, All right, you've made your point. Grandma looked at him. What point do you think I'm making? That you don't trust me. I don't. The directness of it seemed to stun him. Mom leaned forward. Ruth. Grandma did not look at her. Dad stared at his mother. You're saying that because Morgan has spent weeks filling your head with this. I felt Ethan shift beside me, but I stayed still. Grandma said, Morgan did not move my money. She has been angry since the wedding. She did not move my money. She has been asking questions designed to make everything look as bad as possible. She did not move my money. Dad finally snapped. I was going to put it back. Grandma's expression changed. Not dramatically. If you did not know her, you might have missed it. But I knew. She had been waiting for him to say that. With whose money? Dad went still. Mom looked at him. Chelsea looked at him. Ryan looked at him. And Dad looked at me. He did not point. He did not say my name. He just looked at me. I felt something inside me settle. For weeks I had been trying to find the moment when my parents had decided I would be the solution. I already had Mom's text. I had the voicemail. I had the old pattern. But that one glance made the entire system visible, without adding a single new fact. Grandma asked again, With whose money, Robert? Dad looked away from me. I had options. I almost laughed. Mom jumped in. Of course he had options. Chelsea reached for her phone. Mom saw it. What are you doing? Chelsea unlocked the screen. You told me Morgan was twisting everything. She is. You told me Dad thought Grandma had agreed. He did. You sent me this to prove it. Mom's face changed. Only slightly. That was enough. Chelsea held up the screenshot. I did not need to see it again. Mom said, "That message is completely out of context." Chelsea's voice was quiet. I read the whole screenshot you sent me. Then you know exactly what I meant. I know what you wrote. Mom turned toward Dad. This is ridiculous. Chelsea read the line aloud. If Ruth needs it sooner, Morgan can cover it. She always has money set aside. Nobody spoke. Mom looked at me. I expected embarrassment. What I saw was anger. You always have money set aside. There was something almost accusatory about the way she said it. I stared at her. That doesn't make it yours. No one said it was ours. You spent Grandma's money assuming mine would replace it. We assumed you would help your family. No. You assumed you didn't have to ask. That is not the same thing. It is exactly the same thing. Dad cut in. We knew we could return the money. I looked at him. With mine. I didn't say that. You didn't have to. Mom shook her head. This is what I mean. You take every sentence and turn it into the worst possible interpretation. Chelsea looked at her. Mom, you sent me the text. I sent it because I thought you were mature enough to understand context. Chelsea's face hardened. What context makes Grandma's money yours? Do not talk to me like that. Why not? Because I am your mother. Chelsea gave a short, bitter laugh. So? That might have been the first time in her life the word because had not worked on her. Dad stood halfway, then sat again. This is getting out of control, Grandma said. No. It was out of control when you could move my money without asking. Dad turned toward her. I was trying to keep Chelsea's family together. Ryan finally spoke. You didn't. Dad looked at him. Ryan's voice stayed level. You helped her hide things from me. That did not protect our marriage. It made the problem larger. Chelsea looked down. Ryan continued. I'm not saying you created all of it. You didn't. Chelsea made choices. I made mistakes too. But paying bills behind my back did not save anything. Mom said, so what were we supposed to do? Watch her lose her family? I heard the old rule in the question. Someone is in crisis. Therefore, every boundary becomes negotiable. Grandma answered before I could. You could have helped with your own money. Mom looked offended. We did. Grandma tapped the statement on the table. Not all of it. Silence again. Dad rubbed his forehead. This has been blown completely out of proportion. Grandma looked at him for a long time. You took $40,000 I had set aside. I moved it. You could not return it when I needed it. I could have. You called Morgan. Dad did not answer. You told her it had to be today. No answer. You left her a voicemail saying it needed to be replaced before I started asking questions. Mom looked at Dad. That was the first time I saw her react to the voicemail. Not because she had not known he called me. Because I did not think she had heard exactly what he said. Dad's eyes moved toward me. You kept that? Yes. His mouth tightened. I did not pull out my phone. I did not play it like some dramatic recording in a courtroom. I did not need to. Dad knew what he had said. Grandma knew. The rest of the evidence already existed around it. He said, I was under pressure. Grandma nodded once. Pressure does not make my money yours. Mom stood. I cannot sit here and listen to this anymore. Grandma looked up at her. Then leave. Mom froze. For a second, I thought she might. Instead, she sat back down. Dad looked at me again. You happy? No. You've spent weeks on this. Because Grandma asked what happened. This is revenge. No. Yes, it is. Ever since the wedding, you've wanted to prove we chose wrong. I felt the sentence hit somewhere old. For a moment, I was back in the reception hall, looking at the empty chairs. Then I looked at Dad. You did choose wrong. Mom inhaled sharply. I continued before she could speak. You chose wrong when you decided Chelsea's crisis automatically mattered more than my wedding. You chose wrong when you decided Grandma's money could be moved because you thought you could put it back. You chose wrong when you assumed my savings were part of your plan. Dad shook his head. There. Finally. This is about the wedding. Grandma spoke before I could. This stopped being about her wedding when you spent my money. Dad's face hardened. Nobody rescued him from the sentence. Not Mom. Not Chelsea. Not me. He turned toward Grandma. So what do you want? I want the accounting completed. You'll get it. I want every dollar that belongs to me returned. It will be. And you will never manage another dollar for me. Dad stared at her. Mom. No. One mistake after everything I've done for you? Grandma's voice was tired now, but still steady. This was not a mistake like writing the wrong check. I was trying to help. You keep saying that as if help is something the person receiving it does not get to define. Dad looked wounded. For the first time, I understood that he probably was. That did not make Grandma wrong. Mom whispered, This family is never going to recover from this. Chelsea looked at her. Maybe it shouldn't recover the same way. Mom stared at her as if she had been slapped. Dad turned to me one last time. Morgan could have fixed this with one phone call. That sentence opened something in me. Not rage. Clarity. I looked at him. That was the problem, Dad. You always knew I could fix it, so none of you ever had to stop breaking things. Nobody answered. I did not feel victorious. I felt finished. The meeting ended without anyone formally declaring it over. Ryan left first. Chelsea followed a few minutes later without leaving with Mom and Dad. Mom stood near the front door waiting for Dad, angry enough that she could barely look at me. Dad said goodbye to Grandma. She answered him. That surprised me. He was still her son. Consequences did not erase that. After the front door closed behind them, the house became very quiet. Ethan asked Grandma if she wanted help cleaning up the coffee cups. She said no. Chelsea's empty glass still sat on the table beside the blue ledger. I began collecting papers. Grandma stopped me. Leave them. I sat back down. For a minute, none of us spoke. Then I said, I should probably send Denise something before Mom calls her. Grandma looked at me. No. I almost argued. Then I remembered. Her decision. Okay. Don't send anything to the family. I thought I understood. After everything that had happened, Grandma still wanted peace. A part of me was disappointed. I did not say so. She picked up her phone. I watched her open the family message thread. Grandma? She adjusted her glasses. I'm not asking you to defend yourself. Her thumbs moved over the screen. I'm going to tell them what happened to me. Grandma sent the message the following Monday morning. She did not ask me to edit it. That was probably good. Because I would have turned it into a timeline with bullet points and supporting documents. And Grandma had no interest in sounding like an attorney. Her message was short. She said I had never asked for access to her accounts, never asked to become her power of attorney, and never received money from her. She said she had chosen independent professional help because the decision was hers. She said Dad had transferred $40,000 she had set aside for Harbor Pines without her permission, and that Mom knew the money might be needed sooner than expected, and had discussed me as the person who could replace it. Then she wrote one final sentence. I am not confused, and Morgan is not speaking for me. I read it twice after she sent me a copy. Are you sure? I asked. She looked offended. I already sent it. I noticed. Then it is a little late to ask. I smiled. Grandma did not send bank statements. She did not forward Mom's text. She did not attach the voicemail. She gave the family enough to understand that the version they had been hearing did not come from her. The response was not dramatic. Nobody formed a line outside Mom's house to apologize. Nobody announced that Robert and Linda were banished from the family. That was not how consequences worked. They arrived unevenly. Aunt Denise called me first. I owe you an apology, she said. You don't owe me anything. I called you and repeated things I hadn't checked. That part was your choice. She went quiet. I almost softened the sentence immediately. That was an old reflex. Make the other person comfortable. Remove the sting before they had to sit with it. I stopped myself. Denise said, You're right. That was enough. Another relative never apologized but stopped calling me about Grandma. Someone else texted that they were glad Ruth had professional help. A cousin asked Grandma directly whether she needed anything instead of calling Mom for information first. Those changes looked small from the outside. Mom noticed every one of them. For years, information in our family had moved through her. Someone got sick, Mom knew. Someone's marriage was struggling, Mom knew. Someone needed help, Mom assigned roles. She did not simply participate in the family. She managed the emotional traffic. After Grandma's message, people started going around her. Grandma scheduled appointments without telling Mom. Chelsea stopped reporting every argument with Ryan. When relatives wanted to know how Grandma was doing, they called Grandma. Mom still had a family. She just stopped being its switchboard. She hated that more than she would have hated being yelled at. I knew because she told me. About 2 weeks after the meeting, she called and said, "Do you have any idea what you've done?" I was leaving work. "I didn't send Grandma's message. You helped create the situation that made her send it. Dad created the situation when he moved her money. You see? This is why nobody can talk to you anymore. Everything is so black and white. No, some things are complicated. Taking money someone told you not to move is not one of them." Mom exhaled sharply. "Your grandmother barely tells me anything now. That's between you and Grandma. Chelsea won't talk to me either. That's between you and Chelsea. She and Ryan are living apart. That's between Chelsea and Ryan. Do you hear yourself? Yes. You don't care what happens to this family." I stood beside my car and let the accusations sit there. A few months earlier, I might have rushed to prove the opposite. "I care," I said. "I just don't think caring means I'm responsible for controlling what everyone does next." "You sound very pleased with yourself." "I'm not." "Then fix it." The word almost made me laugh. Instead, I said, "No." Mom hung up. I did not call back. Dad's financial accounting took most of the summer. There was nothing cinematic about it. No sheriff showed up at dinner. No judge froze every account overnight. Dad provided records through the process Grandma's attorney had set up, sometimes slowly enough that additional requests had to be made. The review confirmed the $40,000 transfer, the timing of the large payments around Hawaii and Chelsea's debts, and enough of the older activity to justify Grandma's demand that he explain and repay what he could not properly account for. The older transactions were messier than the current one. That mattered. We never got some perfect document proving every dollar I had loaned Dad years earlier had been used to refill money taken from Grandma. The timing supported the pattern. Some of Dad's records supported parts of it, but I stopped needing the story to be cleaner than reality. The current $40,000 was enough. Grandma's attorney explained her options. Dad could cooperate with a repayment agreement and produce the remaining records. Or Grandma could continue pursuing formal civil remedies and a more aggressive accounting. Dad chose repayment. I heard about most of it from Grandma, not because I inserted myself into the process, but because she sometimes wanted to talk. The thing he sold was his boat. Dad had owned it for years. He loved that boat in a way I never understood. It was not enormous or luxurious enough to belong in a magazine, but he polished it obsessively, talked about upgrades as if he were managing a naval fleet, and spent summer weekends taking people out on the lake. When I was younger, I thought the boat represented freedom to him. By the time he listed it with a broker, I understood it represented something else too. Proof that he had done well. Proof that he could afford things. Proof that Robert Harris was the man who handled money, instead of the man who needed help with it. The sale did not happen overnight. There were inquiries, a buyer, paperwork, and the usual delays. By July, the proceeds had become the main source Dad used to satisfy the repayment arrangement, along with his own available funds. Grandma never asked me to cover a gap. Dad never asked again. For once, the person who made the decision carried the financial cost of it. Chelsea's consequences were slower. She and Ryan remained apart through much of the summer. He stayed with his brother for a while, and they worked through their accounts piece by piece. I knew only what they chose to tell me. Chelsea closed some credit cards. She froze others. She sold the expensive SUV she had insisted 2 years earlier was necessary because of the children, though the replacement vehicle transported the same children just fine. Ryan and Chelsea started counseling, but neither of them talked as if counseling guaranteed anything. That was probably healthy. One afternoon in July, Chelsea asked if I wanted coffee. I nearly said no. Then I said yes. We met at a place halfway between our houses. She looked tired, but different. Less polished. not worse. Just less committed to looking like everything was fine. I'm starting to pay Grandma back, she said. I looked at her. You don't have to tell me. I know. How? Monthly. What I can afford. Does Grandma want that? Yes. Then good. Chelsea stirred her coffee. Ryan says paying her back doesn't make what I did okay. He's right. I know. That answer had become easier for her. She looked toward the window. I keep thinking about Hawaii. I waited. I knew enough to ask, she said. I just didn't want the answer. I remembered the first time she had said almost those exact words. This time there was no defense around them. That's yours to live with, I said. She nodded. I did not hug her. I did not tell her everything was forgiven. I did not say she was a victim of Mom and Dad, and therefore none of it counted. But when she asked later whether I could send her Grandma's new mailing address after the move, I did. That was where our relationship stood. A door unlocked, not wide open. Grandma lost the first Harbor Pines unit. For a while that bothered me more than she let it bother her. I knew I could have written a check. Ethan and I had enough liquid savings to do it without destroying ourselves financially. It would have been uncomfortable. It would have cut deeply into the reserve we had spent years building. But we could have done it. I had thought about it more than once. Grandma knew. One afternoon, while we were packing books from her living room, she said, "You're still mad about that apartment." I'm not mad. You alphabetized my cookbooks. That proves nothing. You hate cooking. Fair. She sat on the arm of a chair while I taped a box. I told you not to pay it. I know. You wanted to. I wanted you to have what you chose. And if you had paid it, you would have had the apartment. And Robert would have learned what? I stopped taping. Grandma looked at me. That taking it worked. I hated the answer because she was right. A few weeks later, another unit became available. Not the same one. Grandma said the view was better anyway. By then the repayment process had progressed enough that she could use her own money the way she had intended. Her money, not mine, not Dad's, not family money, hers. Ethan and I helped her move on a warm Saturday near the end of July. Ryan came for a couple of hours with the kids. Chelsea arrived later with boxes and stayed mostly out of Ryan's way. Nobody pretended the awkwardness wasn't there. Mo and Dad did not come. Grandma did not ask them. I carried a box of framed photographs into the new apartment and placed it on the floor beside the bookshelf. Grandma unpacked them herself. There was one from my wedding. Ethan and I were standing outside the venue, his hand around mine, both of us laughing at something I no longer remembered. Grandma had been the one who ordered a print. She placed it on the shelf. For a second, I noticed who was missing. Then I noticed who was there. That felt new. Grandma adjusted the frame. I suppose I should decide what happens to all of these when I die. Please don't turn moving day into estate planning. She smiled. Then her expression became serious. This is about my money while I'm alive, Morgan. Not who gets it when I'm dead. I know. I mean it. I know. I don't want anybody turning this into some story where you protected me because you expected something. I don't. I know you don't. She touched my arm. That's why I'm saying it. There was no new will waiting at the end of the story. No house transferred into my name. No secret account. No reward for being the good granddaughter. I was grateful for that. If Grandma had solved everything by giving me more than everyone else, we would only have rebuilt the same family system with different winners. By August, life had become quieter. Not normal. I did not know what normal meant anymore. Mom called less. Dad almost never did. Chelsea and Ryan were still figuring out whether their marriage could survive honesty after years of avoiding it. Grandma complained about Harbor Pines coffee exactly as predicted and somehow made 3 friends within 2 weeks. Ethan and I finally finished our wedding thank you cards. Then, on the morning of August 8th, Dad called. I watched his name on my screen longer than I should have. Ethan was making coffee. You going to answer? I don't know. That's allowed. I answered. Hi, Dad. His voice sounded older. Maybe that was real. Maybe I simply heard him differently. You got what you wanted. I leaned against the kitchen counter. No. Mom says half the family treats her like a stranger. I said nothing. Your grandmother fired me. She revoked your financial authority. Same thing. No, Chelsea barely speaks to us. That's between you and Chelsea. He laughed bitterly. You've got a phrase for everything now. I've always had phrases. What else would you call this, Morgan? I knew what he wanted. He wanted me to admit this was revenge. He wanted the consequences to belong to me, because then he would not have to accept that they belonged to his decisions. Consequences, I said. He was silent. Then he said, You could fix this. I closed my eyes. There it was, the old job. The role waiting for me like a chair someone had assumed I would occupy forever. I could call Grandma and tell her Dad had learned his lesson. I could encourage Chelsea to invite Mom over. I could organize dinner. I could convince Aunt Denise that everyone needed to move on. I could tell Mom I understood why she chose Chelsea. I could start absorbing discomfort until everyone else felt comfortable again. I probably could have made things easier. That was what I had always been good at. For most of my life, I had confused being capable with being responsible. If I could carry something, I assumed I should. If I could fix something, my family assumed I would. That was how people like Dad learned they could keep breaking things. He waited. You could fix this, he said again. I opened my eyes. I know. Then I hung up. You should never confuse being capable with being responsible for everyone else's mistakes. Helping family can be generous, but real help requires honesty, consent, and respect. If someone spends your money, assumes you will rescue them, or uses guilt to make you clean up consequences they created, you are allowed to say no. You can love people without financing their bad decisions, protecting their lies, or sacrificing your peace to keep the family comfortable. Sometimes the healthiest thing you can do is stop fixing what others refuse to stop breaking. If this story resonated with you, subscribe to the channel for more family stories about boundaries, truth, and consequences.